to the core. Wake up from this war. Wake up, selfish you. Wake up, kill this dream, 'cause I can't leave you, I won't leave you. Now I'm wide awake and so are you. We're left to believe that it's all true. No, I've never heard you say it all before. Locked up, got stuck, crawling on the floor. Yeah. Wake up from this war. Wake up, selfish soul. Wake up, kill this dream, 'cause I can't leave you, I won't leave you now. Wake up, take what's yours. Wake up, like before. Wake up, take me by the hand and lead me through this open door. Did you feel it from the start? Or was there something missing all along? Would you change it if you could? Or would you fake it till the end? I'm left for dead and so are you. Don't care what's real, don't care what's true. No. Wake up from this war. Wake up, selfish you. Wake up, need to end this pain inside, 'cause there's no us no more. Wake up, no more. Wake up, no more. Wake up, 'cause I will leave you, I need to leave you now. Fell from the tower, sipping on grace, pushing on the problems to another day. I'm getting close on the long way home, but I might not make it anyway. Paper piled high, covering the door, my long list of problems from the ceiling to the floor. Feeling like a Monday, my Sunday chore. Felt a bit behind and a little bit more. I'll deal with tomorrow when it comes, whatever it does. I'll wake up and live it, then don't worry, my friend. Time waits for nobody, won't you wait and see? Tomorrow's gonna deal with me. Gonna pull the lever, gonna get what I can take. Rolling into heaven with a smile on my face. High by the devil, kissing Peter on the cheek. That's a four-man war with holy Trinity. Spit fire, and I don't need your plan. But you know I could use a little money in my hand. I'll deal with tomorrow when it comes, if ever it does. I'll wake up and live with it, then don't worry, my friend. Time waits for nobody, don't you wait and see. Tomorrow's gonna deal with me. feel it at first, but my shin bone is exposed. Maybe it won't hurt if I don't look. It'll only get worse the more I'm home, pretending I don't miss you. God, I hope that I can see you soon. No sense in ever looking behind me. If that was my life, why would I be here instead? I didn't feel it at first, but my heart is broken, and now I gotta sleep in this bed that I made. And it'll only get worse the more I'm home, pretending I don't miss you. God, I hope that I can see you
Hey, how's it going, everybody? I'm Ben from Universal Audio, and welcome to a very special live stream. Today, we're gonna be diving as deep as possible into accelerated real-time monitoring, otherwise known as ARM. Drew is gonna walk us through everything you guys need to know about using ARM, how to set it up, all the different kind of use cases, workflows, and of course, this isn't just like a one-directional thing. So if you guys have got questions and been running into things inside of Luna, especially specifically related to accelerated real-time monitoring, now's the time to ask your questions because we'll have all the answers for you. So yeah, let's just dive right into it and meet the guys. What's up, Drew? Matt, how you guys doing today?
Good morning. Good
Good.
morning.
How you doing,
everybody?
Nice. Man, so yeah, we this is we're trying something a little bit different. You know, we've done tons of office hours where we've kind of like shown, ARM is a part of everything that we show. You know, anytime we're doing something real time inside of Luna, right? It's ARM is the reason that it's all working. But we haven't really spent a lot of time just specifically around all the things that people need to know about ARM. And I guess, at a high level, how would you describe ARM to somebody, Drew?
Well, for me, it's ARM is all about creating the lowest latency path no matter what you're doing. So it's ARM is really cool in that Luna automatically in the background, no matter whether you're starting a project from scratch or whether you're in the middle of a dense mix and you've got a lot of things going on and you just need to add that one little overdub. ARM is what is making it all happen in the background, giving you that lowest latency possible. And it's something that people have been accustomed to previously with console and the third-party DAWs, but Luna is new in the sense that it brings it all together into a single window, single app, and it really streamlines that process. So we're gonna look at that in depth today. So
Awesome. Well, and before we before we really dive off the deep end, quick note for everybody: there's an update available. 1.0.6. It's up.
There
It's
is.
out. Right?
It's available.
Yeah.
Available in app.
In app, yeah. So if you're running Luna right now, go into the app. You can do check for updates. Right up there, it'll update the app. It'll give you all the notes about what's been fixed. And most of it we covered on Monday's show, where we kind of previewed a lot of those features. So hopefully they're already, hopefully you're already excited and familiar with what's going in there. And yeah, just it's so cool to see that every couple of weeks we're getting Luna updates and just bug fixes, little new features that are all kind of at the top of the list. And also, there's bigger features being worked on in the background as well. So getting your guys' feedback in real time has been so helpful to be able to shape where this app is going. So keep on hitting the feedback button. Let us know what you guys need. And yeah, so let's, I guess, anything else before we get going here, Drew?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think we're ready to dive right in. So let me share screen, and let's start out by I've got a session set up here that I'm going to kind of use for the entire stream here. There'll be a few times where I throw it over to Matt to look at different configurations, but I have a multi-unit Apollo set up here. There's 4 Apollos mixture. There's a couple X8Ps, X16, and a twin. So this kind of represents that case, that the larger multi-unit case. Matt will be showing some things throughout the stream for the other stuff, but let's start by let's just start by the basics, right? Let's start by how to turn on and off ARM. The most obvious example here is in the mixer GUI over here on the left-hand side. We have a dedicated ARM button. This is the most obvious way of turning it on. You also do have in the transport, you have the transport menu rather, you have the ability to turn it on and off here with the checkbox.
Nice.
And then there's a third spot here. If you're not up here in the header area of Luna, you've got this workflow tabs, right? And the first one, if you click on it, is called recording, or the record workflow tab. And it exposes a couple of buttons, and pre-roll and post-roll live here, but also another instance of ARM. And the reason why I'm showing you this, another ARM button rather, to toggle it on and off. And I'm showing you this one because this one is special, and it's the one, it's an area where it shows you the available ARM paths, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because what ARM really is, if you're not familiar with it in depth, and I guess that's what the point of this video is, of course, right? Is ARM is Luna using the virtual channels and the digital channels, and even in some edge cases, analog channels. It literally is repurposing and reusing and reallocating the IO inside of your Apollo, right? It's a very deep integration. It's one of the cornerstones of Luna, is this idea that, hey, now that we have the recording app, we can tie into the hardware really tightly. And so rack Apollos are capable of 16 ARM paths. X4 can do 12, Twin can do 10, Arrow can do 2. And even the Silver Apollo, I think that one does 10 or 12 as well. But so the number of ARM paths are based on the units you have and the way they aggregate. So for example, if I come over here and ARM, this might be tough to see because the GUI is kind of small, but when I ARM a track here, you might be able to notice that number of ARM channels has dropped by 1, right? I don't know how well that you can see that, but that's evidence of there. So
yeah.
So,
And it's basically, it's because it's treating the Apollo is basically making these patches inside the device, right? ARM,
yeah.
The way ARM is working is it's doing all the processing, it's doing the routing that needs to happen to be able to get the signal from your input to your monitors or to your headphone system. Its whole goal is to get that signal there as fast as possible.
Yeah. Yep. And it's and it's bypassing everything. It's bypassing the app and just making the straightest, most low latent path that we can. And we'll talk about that when we dig in a little bit more.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, I wanted to start with that, just telling you how to turn it on and how to see that it's on. At the end of the stream, we will talk about some scenarios where you might want to turn it off. But generally speaking, it defaults to on, and you pretty much always want to leave it on, aside from a couple of instances that we will talk about later. So that's first and foremost, is just to talk about how to turn it on and how, what the number of ARM paths you have based on the units and so forth. So let's move to a basic example. First thing, for all of these first examples, I want to note that console tracking mode is off, right? Console tracking mode, we're going to talk about that later in the stream and give it its own segment. But for now, the default is for console tracking mode to be off. And so therefore, everything that I'm about to do is with console tracking mode off. With console tracking mode off, you might notice that Luna automatically mutes all of the channels in console.
Hmm.
You don't have to have console open. I just have it open in order to show you that. But for those of you who are maybe used to the previous Apollo workflow, where console they stayed open or they stayed unmuted and you were able to direct monitor, that's what console tracking mode's all about, and we will cover that. But for now, let's go with the basic default, where Luna kind of takes over console, mutes all those inputs for you.
Hmm. This is kind of
And so
this is the easiest way to really kind of absorb what's going on in Luna, right? Is kind of dedicate going straight into Luna. You can have console closed because Luna's handling all of the stuff that console would do for a different DAW.
correct. You do have to have the UA mix engine running, which that is the blue diamond in the header, the Finder header.
Hmm.
You can't run Luna without the UA mixer engine running, but you do not have to have console launched to do that. I only have it launched to show you a couple things. Matt will probably do the same thing in his segment as well. So that's just for illustrative purposes. But so let's look at what happens. So let's take a track here. Let me just take this kick drum track, and we can pretend that we're doing a recording session. This is obviously something
Hmm.
that's been pre-recorded, but let's just pretend we're doing a recording session.
Yeah,
And
pretend you got a drummer in the room, and
yeah, we've got some tracks created. We've
mhm.
got them named. We don't need to go through all of that process and in this context. So let's just pretend we're doing that. And so here I've got a kick drum track. And the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to assign an input. So I've got it assigned to mic input 2. You'll notice I have all of my stuff custom named, which we can do in the IO matrix. That's super handy to keep things instead of just mic input 1 to mic input 3. You can customize all of those inputs.
Mhm.
So that's what I have done. So you want to pick an input first, and then so when I arm a track, what's actually happening here is that Luna is creating a path. It's grabbing one of those arm paths that we spoke about earlier, and it's creating a path from the input in your Apollo directly to the monitors, directly to the cues. In fact, it is not that signal is not even coming into your computer. It's not coming into the Luna mixer, even though it kind of looks like it is.
Mhm.
It's not, right? It's bypassing everything. By the way, that bypassing also includes buses and extensions. This is something that it takes a little bit of getting used to. But if you scroll down here to your output, this track is armed, and the output is assigned to my drum subgroup, but it is not going there right now, right?
Uh-huh.
It has been disconnected from that. So this is something that takes a little bit of getting used to. By the way, the same holds true for the Luna extensions like the tape, right?
Mhm.
This is a native extension in the Luna mixer, and it's not part of ARM, right? So since I'm in ARM mode and I've armed this track, all of that kind of goes away. And instead, what Luna is focused on is, let me get that signal to the monitors with as lowest latency as possible so that you can hear it and work on the tone, and let me get it to the cues as well, because when you're tracking, that's the most important
Yeah,
part, right?
exactly, and that's the whole reason for ARM, right? Is like it's to get the low latency. It's all about recording. Like, and we already had a question come in over here. Is like, should I turn ARM off when I'm not recording? It's like you don't need to, because
Yeah.
it's not activated. It's a tracking only protocol that comes up. So it's there to make it so when you're tracking, you're getting the low latency
Right.
path, and be able to get UAD processing and have everything go to your monitors or go to your cues with almost as close to zero latency as possible. But then as soon as you're not recording something, ARM is not in use anymore. So there's really
Yeah.
no benefit that I can think of to turning ARM off when you're in mixing mode, is there?
Yeah. The bottom line is this: if you do not have a track armed, we have the two different uses of the word. If you
Yeah.
do not have a track armed, then ARM mode is out of the equation. It doesn't do anything. So,
Hmm.
um,
And it's
okay.
also,
So
yeah, and that's the benefit of it too, right? Because as you saw, like, you put this into record, and Luna right away put in a unison plugin and the record effects that you previously had on there, right?
exactly. Yeah. So it built all of that, and then and similarly, when I unarm it, you'll notice that all of that goes away. What's really cool about Luna is that not only is it going away graphically, but it's also relinquishing the DSP, right? So if you're a
Hmm.
previous Apollo user, you might have gotten into situations where you're mixing and you still have plugins loaded in console, and that's using DSP that you'd rather be using for mixing. With Luna, that can't happen, right? It's dynamically allocatable. It picks and chooses it allocates it, relinquishes it as you on arm and unarm it, which is super cool.
Yeah.
Um, The other thing that's really cool about it is when console tracking mode is off, you'll notice that I've got this track that's set to mic input 2, and
Mm-hmm.
when I arm it, it recalls and builds the 1073 and the LA2 Silver plugin, but you'll plug-in chain rather. But you'll notice if I have this track next to it, which is also happens to be assigned to mic 2, when I
Mm-hmm.
arm it, it is bringing up an entirely different input chain, a different plugin chain. This is an awesome feature of Luna, in that Luna is building and storing and recalling customized input chains per track, right?
Yeah.
This is a really cool feature, right? It's also, by the way, why you can't do this, right? I cannot arm two tracks
With the
that
same
have the
input.
same input assigned, right?
Uh-huh.
Because it's building and relinquishing that DSP. Um, but so this is a super cool feature. By the way, if that bugs you, if you don't want that, console tracking mode, right? We'll talk about that later in the stream, because if you're used to the old way, you can have it both ways, right? Luna allows you to work in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the cool thing about this, and I know you do this, Ben, is that part of your template, you can have 4 or 6 or 10 tracks all assigned to the same input, right?
Yeah.
You know, your 4 different bass rigs or your 6 different guitar rigs, all fed by the same high Z input. But each one has its own customizable chain. So that's really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, so let's go back to our original example. Let's look at the first armed track. And you'll notice that we've got this customized. We have the unison slot, right? We all know about unison. It's impedance matching, gain staging. Matt did a great video of it. We did a great stream on it, on the unison gauge staging. And then you also have your up to 4 record effects, right? Only 2 are showing now because the slots are dynamic. So if I wanted to, I could hit fixed slots, which would show me all of the slots available to me, right? That's a different way of looking at Luna's GUI. It can either be expandable as needed or show all of you. So here are the 4 record effect slots. And then you'll also notice down here, inside of Luna's insert section, right? Separate from the input section, which is on the Apollo. These first 4, notice how these first 4 are highlighted with a little gold outline. These are also part of the ARM mode, right? So ARM gives you the unison slot, 4 record effects slots. All of that gets committed no matter what, gonna go to disk with all of that processing on it, which is a good thing, by the way, right? I encourage people to, commit, right? Don't be afraid to commit the basics, right?
Yep.
But let's say I'm working and I'm getting sounds and I'm like, yeah, I'm not so sure about this, right? This compressor, it's a simple matter of dragging it down to the bottom, and it's now in the monitor path, right? And I'm monitoring it and I'm hearing it, and so are the musicians, right? Everybody's hearing it, but it's not being committed, right? If I want, I can put it right back in there, and it's doing what it needs to do, right? So I have my unison 4 record effects as well as 4 of the insert slots. Now, there's a couple things you should know. So, for example, if I were to when I unarm the track, you'll notice that all 8 inserts come back.
Mm-hmm.
If I happen to have something, let's say it's even let's say I happen to have even a UA plugin in this 5th slot. When I arm the track, you will notice that one goes away, right?
Yeah.
That one does go away. And let's say, let me remove that. And let's say in this 5th slot, I also happen to have, I want to put a native plugin, right? An AU plugin. It will allow me to put it in there, but when I arm the track, it will bypass it. And actually, new to 106, which was just released today, new to 106, prior to 106, Luna would actually hide the AU plugins from you. Now it doesn't do that. So for example, if the track is armed and I try and put FabFilter on there, it'll show it to me.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it will allow me to select it and even load it. But in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see here, it gives you a little error, a little dialog box saying, hey, we can put that plugin in there. You're not going to hear it just yet. But, and then of course, when I unarm the track, it'll be there for me.
Yeah, and this is like the key to know about how ARM is working. This is kind of a big clue about that, right? Of the reason why native plugins don't work when you're in ARM mode is that would require a trip. Your audio would have to travel out of your Apollo into your computer to be
Yep.
processed natively through that plugin, and then back to your Apollo. And that it's physics. That travel time takes time.
Yeah.
So that's where latency would get added. And ARM's, the purpose of ARM, we'll keep on saying it, is like its whole point
Yeah.
is to get the audio from whatever you're playing back out to you as quickly as possible. So that trip, if you were to make that, you would just be adding latency that you're not looking to do. So
Yeah.
Luna's giving you that helpful hand of saying like, hey, I know you want this, you may want this plugin, use it later for mixing, of course. But while you're tracking, if you want to have the closest connection to your sound, I'm going to bypass it for you automatically.
Yeah.
And so that actually brings up, I had a good question here in the chat from Rick asking, why is there a decibel difference sometimes between when you record an able track and then when you take it out of record and just play it back?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's something that we, that you do. It goes back to what I had said previously about when I arm this track, right?
Hmm.
This track, when prior to being armed, was routed to a bus called drums, and that flowed over to here.
Hmm.
It might have had some processing on it, and then it ultimately went over to my stereo bus. Well, when I arm that track, that connection's broken. Remember that we go, the signal never leaves the Apollo, right? Yeah, that
Hmm.
connection is broken. And so now this fader is actually not controlling the feed to the drum bus, but instead it's controlling the feed to the monitors, right? So
Hmm.
let's say, for example, I had this master, right? Let's say prior to arming the track, I had this master pulled down just because that's where it needed to be in the mix, right?
Yep.
Well, that's pulling down the playback level of this track, this kick drum track that's feeding the bus.
Hmm.
Now, so that volume is taken into account prior to arming the track. But the moment I do that, then that signal is no longer sent to the bus and therefore no longer turned down, and that will cause a spike, right? And the reverse is true, right? If I have this bus up above zero,
Hmm.
thereby adding level to this track that's feeding it, the moment I do that, you'll have a decrease in volume because of that. So it's about the volume, and it's also about the processing, right? If you have processing on that bus that is up here, that is pumping up the volume,
Yep.
then as soon as you go into ARM mode, that goes away, right?
Hmm.
Um,
So
so that's the answer.
yeah, exactly, and it's just it's a good reason to really keep your gain staging in mind, right, as you're doing this sort of stuff. And
Yeah.
this is kind of where like the best practice of trying to use your input levels and use your insert processing, use those to really make it so that your faders can all be living pretty happily at zero.
Yeah.
And then that way when you go into ARM mode like this, it's not a drastic change.
Yeah.
Well, and also again too, like there's what are the major times you're going to use ARM are when you're tracking, so when you're doing kind of the start of a session, the creation part, or you're going to be overdubbing. And so
Yeah.
either one of those, they're kind of usually a creation phase type thing. So it's the only time I've ever gotten in a sticky spot myself is having done like a full mix and then going back to re-record a part that was bus through a bus through a bus through like some final
Yeah.
through all my limiter, like through
Yeah.
the final chain. The minute you kind of take a step out of that, okay, yeah, and you got to pull the fader down a little bit just to compensate.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So yeah, it's actually kind of a cool thing in a sense too, because when you arm a track, that you now understand that this now you can do whatever you want with that level. Now that becomes like your live monitoring level. So
Hmm.
you're actually kind of especially if you have some automation, you're free to kind of do whatever you want while you've armed that track and while you're doing the overdub. And then when you unarm it, the automation is going to cause it to snap back to where it was previously, and you're back in business. So
Yeah.
um,
Well,
so that generally works itself out.
totally. And so back to what you were talking about with the inserts. So yeah, super helpful to kind of just know the number, but also there's a little cheat, right? So when you have something in ARM, you can see this little yellow box that's kind of drawn around, and
Yeah.
that's what's helping indicate what's being processed and utilized through ARM, correct?
Yeah, correct. And you're going to see that throughout this entire stream when we talk about sends and auxes and all that stuff. So you can the GUI, the guys spend a lot of time giving you visual cues in the GUI. So yeah, this shows you that these four are part of ARM, and it grays out these for you, the ones that aren't a part of the ARM path.
Nice.
Um, okay, so let's take a look at let's broaden this out a little bit. Let's go from maybe adding some tracks in. So
Mhm.
let's say we're doing drums and I want to arm these tracks. I want to configure these tracks. You'll notice I've selected from the kick out down here to the floor. I'm gonna use a couple keyboard shortcuts. Shift Option Command, right? Shift Option Command is going to allow me to sequentially number some inputs, right? So if I hold down that keyboard shortcut first and click on the mic input here, and this guy starts on 2, so I want this guy to start on 3. So I'm going to click on 3, and you'll notice that Luna sequentially numbers my mic inputs for there, right?
Nice.
From 3 to 9. If I add my kick in back into the selection and I do Shift R, then you'll notice we can see arm happening full blast, right, on multiple tracks, right? This could be as many arm paths as you have per unit, right? You're limited to that, but you'll see those come into play. And so this is obviously a pre-made session, but this is me earlier in the day building these input paths. Luna's remembering them. Luna is recalling them for me for every armed track that you see fit. So I just kind of wanted to show you how this expands outward into large tracking sessions. So if you have a lot of DSP in your Apollo, if you have a multi-unit system with lots of inputs, right, you can build pretty complex. I mean, like I hazard to guess what it would have taken in the analog world to come up with these chains, right? I mean, you could be in the best studio in the world, right? Doing all this stuff. So
But you're probably still not going to have a Neve 1073 right next to an API, next to a Helios,
Exactly.
all sitting next to your SSL. Like the power bill for that room to have all 4 different types of consoles in one room would be insane. And that's the great part about working this way is you can mix and match. You can be super precise about your choices, and then it's saved with the track. Like hopefully people saw this. Like your kick out track, you reassigned its input from 2 to 3. But guess what? It's still remembered like, hey, kick out, he wanted the API vision. So who cares what input you have assigned to it at the moment? That you've tied together the track with its real-time input processing. And again, it's great. It's so nice to know that like all this processing is committed to. So you're getting, you get to process, you get the sound, and you get the tone that you want on the way in. And then as soon as you unrecord enable these tracks, all that DSP gets freed up now for mixing purposes.
Yeah. So as soon as Shift R to unarm those tracks, the DSP is relinquished, and everything goes back to the way it was. Excuse me. So that's the basics of ARM as it pertains to an individual track or a group of audio tracks that you have armed and you're getting ready to record onto them. Matt's going to cover instrument tracks later on in the stream, so if you're wondering about that, don't worry, we are going to cover that. But let's turn our attention to cues. Unless there's anything, guys, any other questions in the chat pertaining to this, or if you feel like we've covered this initial segment, we're ready to move on to cues. You think?
Yeah, I think there's some good basics. I had a question over here on Facebook of how does ARM affect computer CPU? Easy answer. It doesn't.
It doesn't.
That's the beauty of it.
ARM. This is all happening inside of your Apollos, and it is a per Apollo thing, right, Drew? So you've got, you and I, we've both got some multi-unit setups here. So the processing, that's happening on my X8, those tracks, the DSP and the ARM assignments, everything is happening inside that box. Same for the X16. Like they're each kind of acting independently. Again, just because sending audio from one thing to another thing, that incurs latency. That's unacceptable.
That's a good point, Ben. That's an important. We probably should stress that because I see that a lot on a day-to-day basis. People have a twin duo or an arrow or something, and they add a satellite, and they think, oh, well, this is going to expand my tracking capabilities. And I always remind people that the DSP needs to be local, right? The DSP needs to be local to the input, right? You think about it in those terms. If the input exists on your X8, then the DSP must be available and be used there too. So
what's the optimal amount of DSP chips needed to have all plugins and buses armed?
Wow, there's just there's no way to answer that because we have a DSP chart, right? So if you Google UAD DSP chart, right, we have a DSP chart that shows you what percentage of a chip a given plugin uses, right? So I'm being a little heavy-handed here. I mean, I like the good stuff, right? I'm a 1073 and now 1084 guy. 1084 is sort of taken over my life now. So it's so good. So yeah, 1084s across the way, LA2 Mark twos, which I love that, the LA2 Mark II is a big one for me. So, there's some heavy lifting to be done there. So, but if you're using the Analog Classics bundle that comes with every Apollo, they're very DSP efficient. You could do a lot. If I
Hmm.
were on an X8 with 4 mic pre's and I'm using Analog Classics, I could fill it all up. I could fill it all up with
Yeah.
Analog Classics bundles, plugins, and they sound great. They sound fantastic.
Hmm.
So it's really personal choice.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so that means Thomas over on Facebook. So that means I can only use 6 Shark for ARM, and that's per device exactly. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
if you've got a Apollo X rack, those have 6 DSPs, the hexa processing in them. So it gives you a ton of power that you can assign and be using for ARM. But it is a finite resource. Similar to if you were in a real analog studio. There's only 1 or 2 Pultecs or 1 LA2A.
Yeah.
You'd have to
Right.
pick and choose where to place your favorite pieces.
Yeah.
So
And just to put this into perspective, I just rearmed those tracks, and you'll notice I've got, multiple 1073s, multiple 1084s, LA2 Silver Mark IIs, Helios. These are all the heavy hitters, right?
mhm.
And that's on an X8P, and that's all, I haven't looked at, I'm still have, DSP to spare, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Let's
good to
see.
go.
So, if you could do a real-time test of record enabling a track with no processing routed to the main to show little or no volume change, I can understand on my end. So yeah, let's. This is Rick who was asking about the gain staging thing. So,
Okay.
uh, exactly. So the processing isn't necessarily the biggest issue there. It's the routing through. The easiest way to visualize this right is you've got that kick track faders at 0 going into a drum bus at -10 going into your
Right.
main fader at 0. So that kick track is being decreased by 10 dB as you're listening to it in playback. Now, when you go to record arm it, it's bypassing the drum bus and that main fader, bringing the level up to your speakers 10 dB.
Right.
So
Right.
that's the trick that's going on here. It's kind of hard to show it any
Yeah, I
more.
can't demonstrate it because at the moment I arm the track, it bypasses the bus, and then the moment I would unarm the track, it would then feed that signal, and it would have to be the same signal to be an apples to apples comparison, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Oh, and we got a good question here that we're gonna touch on later, but yeah. So we're saying visual sound on YouTube here is saying so it's only grabbing DSP from Apollos and not satellites. That is
Correct.
correct. Yep.
Correct. Yeah.
Yep.
Correct.
Exactly. So yeah, because this is all happening inside the Apollos, it's not going to travel around and use DSP from other devices, including satellites or even other Apollos. It stays local to the device.
Right.
So where the satellites really come in handy is in a scenario like what Drew has here. He's got tons of tracks here with DSP, with 1084s and 1073s that aren't being touched for ARM. Those Luna in the background is doing the shuffling around and saying, "Cool, this is a playback engine. We can put that over on the satellite to keep the DSP on the Apollo ready to go because he's about to track some drums."
Yeah. Right.
So Luna in the background is doing the shuffling around and allocating the DSP the most efficient way it possibly can. Even if it needs to, like sometimes you'll notice there's a delay. You guys may even see this on the stream, right? Like when Drew hits record on 8 tracks, it doesn't happen instantly. That's because there's physical things being moved around. DSP is getting
Yep.
reallocated across devices to be able to say, all right, great, he needs to record these right now. Let me configure everything so that that happens.
Yeah, and I remember when we were developing Luna, I actually did tests. I took an Arrow and a satellite, and Arrow has one DSP chip in it, but 2 mic inputs. And so while you do need to use only the DSP chip that's on the Apollo, on the Arrow rather, for those inputs, that every time you unarm a track, Luna is smart enough to offload those processes,
Mhm.
right, over to the satellite, right? And then when you arm a track, a separate track, it will build the path you need on the Arrow, and it will dynamically allocate that DSP.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's super smart and efficient in that way.
Hell yeah.
And really, that whole thing, people, this is something maybe people don't know, but our plugins operate in 2 modes, right? The real-time synchronous mode, and then sort of a quote unquote semi-offline buffered mode, which is what satellites do. Satellites and accelerators use that buffered offline mode, which a little bit extra latency, but there's a little bit extra buffering in there, so they're not really suitable for real-time operation. And then you have the ones that live on the Apollo, right?
Mhm.
By the way, there are tricks, live track mode. If you're a hardcore Apollo user, you might be familiar with live track mode, which is a way of kind of reducing that buffering to make lower latency paths for satellites. You could Google that and watch there's some videos on that if you really wanted to go beyond, the scope of what we're doing here today, even.
Yeah. Oh, and so Victor just messed up my virtual tracks. More head scratching. Don't worry, Victor. We're gonna get to you, man. Like we know exactly what you're running into, and we've got some answers for you. So just hang in with us today, and we're definitely gonna address that.
Yeah.
And then we're getting some good comments here from I'm Arnott saying, yeah, so an Octo Apollo would be very nice. I think we all agree. Hit the,
Well, you can see, yeah, we were so happy to get the X series with with 6. The Hexa DSP was a 50% increase. That was huge.
Right. Yep. So yeah, hit the feedback button. Let the product team know that you guys are interested in even larger capacity Apollos.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay, so
yeah,
what do you think?
I think we're doing good, man. This is great. We're yeah. So that's
Ready
kind of the
to
basic.
move on to queues, you think?
Exactly. That's the
Yep.
basics of ARM. So now let's show people the queue system and really how to get this going.
Yeah, okay, cool. So let's talk about queues. Queues in Luna, by the way, are no change from console, right? In fact, the backbone of Luna is console, right? Even though I'm not showing it here, we're kind of are using that. So, so similar to console, we have up to four stereo queues, right? The Rack series, the Rack Apollos and X4. Some people might not know X4 is capable of 4 queues. So the Rack series and X4 can do up to 4 stereo queues. Twins do 2 queues, and Arrow does a single queue. These are 4 stereo queues, and they can be used as such. They can be used as 4 discrete stereo headphone mixes, or you can get creative with this. Like, and a lot of people have hearbacks and avioms. We can talk, and we will talk a little bit about how you can utilize these 4 queues in maybe some ways you haven't thought of. But let's first start out by we can look at them here in the Luna mixer. And here again, you got to visualize that even though these are in the Luna mixer, these are DSP paths baked into your Apollo. This stuff is happening on the Apollo, not in the native world, right? So I've had a lot of people asking about, well, hey, why can't I use sends to send to the headphones? You can't do that because sends are part of the native mixer, right? Whereas the queues are part of that DSP pathway. So here they are in knob form. These guys, if we want to look at a little deeper into the architecture stuff, right? We can look at, if I come down here to the right-hand side and I come to the queue popover, right? Which I can get to through the control room section or in the record workflow pane that I showed you before. I also have a button there that allows me to get to this little queue output popover. And here you can see a lot going on here, but we can see my 4 devices, right? The X16, which does not have any dedicated headphone outs. And then we got the 2 X8Ps and a Twin X. Here, I'm not going to do this because it'll mess up my configuration, but here's where you can determine which specific headphone outputs get fed by which queues, right? So you can choose that here. This is if you have a single unit system or maybe a couple units and those are the only way you're feeding headphones, this is where you're going to determine which queue goes to which specific headphone jack. And so that's all laid out here, nice and graphical, and you can see it. By the way, over here, you can see that I've got my Twin automatically taking over talkback control, and you can tell that the A unit is the X16. That's my my master or A unit. The master unit is special in that it is responsible for monitors, alt monitors, queues, and clocking. That's always the case with the A unit. And so, and then up here at the top, you can see my 4 queues listed. I can choose whether to mono them, or I can choose whether or not for them to feed the mix, right? So imagine you're doing a quickie overdub and it's just like one little vocal line or one little ad lib part, and you don't want to have to make a whole headphone mix. It's a simple matter of coming over here and just clicking mix, and you can see in the background, notice that Q2 grayed out. Yeah. Q2 grayed out, and that's letting me know that, hey, this queue is no longer active. It's no longer feeding its signal to wherever you had it, to whatever you had it sent to, and it's been replaced by the mon left to right or the mix output.
Nice.
The moment I
by
undo
default,
that, it comes back.
And by default, so if people pull this up and they haven't customized their system yet, by default it listens to the mix, correct?
Matt, Ben, it's been so long since I've had a default configuration. I'm not 100% sure about that. I don't know how to, I'm
Yeah,
not sure of that answer. Matt, you know that?
yeah, that's right. The mix is routed to the headphone outputs by default because
Okay.
that's usually what you want. If you have something plugged in, you want to be able just to plug your headphones in and hear signal right away. So
Yeah, right. Yeah. Imagine a mixing scenario. You plug your headphones in. Yeah, you just want to hear the mix. So that makes perfect sense. For
yeah,
me, my studio is set up for primarily live tracking. And by the way, you'll see that right here. That I have my 4 cues. This is something I have them mirrored to outputs, right? And here's where you can see how the A unit, which in my case is an X16, the A unit is responsible for Q mirrorings, right? So I said monitors, alt monitors, and Qs,
Mm-hmm.
and Q mirroring is what I meant there. So Q1 I have mirrored to line out 9 and 10 and so forth and so on down the line. And this is great for this feeds. First of all, this feeds just line level signal. There's no volume control here.
Yeah.
This is just you sending line level signal out to external headphone amps. These can be simple stereo headphone amps that just turn up that signal, and it's just an easy, convenient way of getting the cue out to an external amp. Or, as we'll discuss in a minute when I get back over here into the Q sends, this is also where you would connect your Hearback or Aviom, where you might have these mirrored. I don't have, if you have an X8 or an X8P, the ADAT outs will show up here. So a lot of people do this workflow where you are mirroring your cues to the ADAT outputs, and that light pipe connection is connected to a Hearback or an Aviom digitally, and you're able to interface your cues in that way. In my studio, I have Q4 dedicated for the booth, so it sends straight to the booth, and then I have 3 other headphone mixes that go to the studio.
Nice.
So this, by the way, is a global persistent
Oh
configuration.
yeah.
This,
Good to
yeah,
remember.
this will not change. Yeah, this will not change from session to session. So this Q output, whereas anything you do inside of a session, that will be stored and recalled with the session.
Yep.
right.
Important to know.
Yeah.
And once you mirror to those line outputs in the Q outputs panel, those outputs actually become unavailable in the driver, right, Joe?
Yeah, for sure. That's a good point. And let me show you real quick. If we go to the IO matrix, this is what Matt just said. I see this come up a lot on a day-to-day basis as well. You'll notice here there's several areas where it's great. Well, a couple of areas where it's grayed out. Line out 1s through 4. These are my alt mons, right? So since I have my alt count set to 2, because I run 3 sets of monitors, since my alt count is set to 2, the mon left and right is the first output, and then the others go to lines 1 through 4. And then, just as Matt said, the line outs 9 through 16 are grayed out here because of that configuration that I had done with the Q mirroring.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And that was
they
also
kind of supersede that.
And also there was a setting in there too. Hopefully people picked up on it. That you can define how many Q mixes you want. So even if you have a large system like Drew's, if you're only ever using maybe one Q, it allows you to set the Q bus count there on the hardware pane.
Yeah.
So if you can have it anywhere between 2 or 4, and on a smaller system you'll see like an arrow. It's limited. You can only have one Q since it
Right.
only has the one headphone out. So yeah, it's important to know that you can customize that as well.
Yeah, your Q count and your alt count.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and even though those line outputs are unavailable in the driver, I mean, you can still get signal to them because they're being fed by the Qs. You just have to send signal to the Qs instead of directly to those outputs.
Right.
You don't lose functionality.
And we've heard of some people finding some creative routing uses. Since this is a low latency path, there's some tricky stuff that you can do beyond feeding, beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about here in terms of headphones and cues. But just know this is a low latency way to get audio in and back out of your system.
Yep. Yeah. Maybe we'll leave it there for now. Okay, so that's a little bit about the infrastructure type stuff, right? Talking about how you feed individual headphone outputs here in this Q output, as well as the mirroring and what the sources are. So let's go back to the session, and let's see how this impacts things at a local level. So if we go back to my original example of this drum kit, you'll notice that here are my cues, right? And the default behavior the default view for these is to just show knobs, right? And then we have the P for pre-fader and the M for mute. You do have the ability to, if you click on this little expand button, you can turn each cue into a fader if you so desire. By the way, this is also how you access the pan. You'll notice that I can't see the pan here in that condensed view. There's just not room for it, and it's frankly it's not something you touch that often in a queue. So that does that. You can also, by the way, come up here and hit the large button. There's global large and small buttons. If I hit the global large button, you'll notice that expands everything,
Yeah.
it includes the expansion of the input path, the input area, the inserts, and all of your queues, right? Um, in this case, that's probably not what I want to be doing, but just showing it to you so you can do it. You can also do this locally, right? So if I do it here, it makes just them larger. Um, so back down here. So um, I mentioned earlier that there's up to 4 stereo cues, and you can use them as such. And in that way, there's some tricks that we can do, right? If one of a shortcut we have for creating quick cue mixes is, you spend a lot of time creating your monitor mix, right? The mix you want to hear in the control room or you're hearing come out of the speakers, and this can be a great starting point for the cues, right? So we have most users are probably aware of this, but we have the ability to copy the mix to cues, right? So if I come over here and if I right click anywhere in the line of the fader cap is always a nice big target to hit. If I right click, you will see a copy mix to cue. And if I hit when I hit copy mix to Q1, watch these guys up here. And you'll notice that my monitor mix went up to the cues. If I expand that, you can probably, well, let me just undo it and then expand it, and then uh, do it again, right? So if I copy mix to Q, you can see that that mix down here on the monitor mix is now copied to the cues. Creates a good starting point. Of course, you can tweak as needed, and create a quick little starting mix for a headphone mix. And you could do the same, right? If, for the various other ones, and build the customized mixes for each person. This also leads us to, earlier I mentioned hearback systems and avioms. If you're using one of those systems, right? This is something. Let me just zero out that or undo to get that copy to queue. And if you're using one of these systems, then you could use these cues in a different way, right? Instead of thinking of them as 4 stereo cues, one workflow that I recommend a lot for people is to typically dedicate one cue to either a bass stereo mix, right, of everything, right, and then that way you can feed the basic mix to everybody, and then utilize cues 2, 3, and 4 for what we call more me feeds, right? So imagine you have a hearback or an aviom, and on inputs 1 and 2, you get the basic stereo mix, and then input 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are the individual sends here. So you could do it that way. Or maybe you want to do something like this. Maybe you want to send your drums to Q1, right? Because you don't want to overwhelm an artist with 12 tracks of drums to make their own headphone mix, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to do that. So maybe you want to send a drum mix to Q1, and then so the way you separate the cues is, like, let's say down here on the bass, right? If I take the bass, which happens to be a DI and a mic, on Q2, I'm going to select them, and with selection grouping on, whatever I do to one will do to the other. So I can take them and pan them hard left and right and bring that up, right? And if Q2 is mirrored to some line outputs or ADAT outputs that are feeding an aviom or a hearback system, well, now that bass is going to whatever channel I have that patched to. Let's just say that's aviom 3, right? The guitar next to it, I would bring it up and pan it hard right. And since it's going to Q2 right, based on the mirroring, it would go to aviom 4 in our make-believe scenario.
Yeah.
And you get the idea, right? That you now have one stereo mix feeding 1 and 2, and then 6 mono more me's that allow artists to make whatever mix they like.
Yeah, and this is exactly like when we were down at United with Jakir and Cass McCombs. This is exactly how we set up the queue routing system. We're I believe it was Q1 was the stereo drums, and then he did bass hard left on Q2, guitar hard right on Q2, again to get those so that they could each be individual controls. And then on the boxes out in the live room, everyone had controls over just the reasonable amount of tracks that you would want to have.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I'd love to add here is being able to copy to cues is obviously a really powerful way. Me personally, I love turning off pre-fader and just kind of for like say like the drums, for instance. If I did a copy to queue, I would completely forget that I said it, and then I would be tweaking levels, and those levels wouldn't necessarily get updated to the instrumentalist. So by
Yeah.
taking those out of pre-fader and then just setting your cue faders to 0, they're now following your main fader level. So
Yeah.
you can adjust the balance, and that adjusted balance is automatically being sent out to the queue.
Yeah.
So, and there's a really easy way to do that, to quickly unpre fader and 0 out those cues. You want to show them that?
You're talking about like, shift option to click,
Mhm.
right? I selected them and shift option to click. Yeah, and what Ben said, that's a really great workflow, and it doesn't tie your hands either, because if the drummer says, "Hey man, I still want more snare drum," you can just trim it.
Mhm.
Boom. Now they always have a little bit more snare drum than what you set it to, right? Oh, of course, I didn't do the second part of that, which was to undo the pre-fader part, which I did to the whole thing, but. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, the that you still have these function as trims, right? So it's like, this means what Ben's talking about is you're getting my mix plus or minus whatever I've trimmed it up to be.
Yep.
So
Exactly.
yeah, that's a good workflow.
Nice.
All right, cool. So
Yeah, dude, this is
anything else in this one? Any other chat questions that pertain directly to cues?
so there's, I think it'd be good to show people the fact that if you go all the way to the right of your session on the main fader can also be sent to a queue.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and cool workflow. And further gives you even more. Imagine that scenario that I had said, where like if Q1 is tied to Aviom or Hearback system input 1 and 2, then literally in order to feed something to your headphone system, you can just double click on it and do 0, and you're now sending your main output straight to the cues. So you don't have to make a mix. It's kind of like in the Q output sending the mix there,
Mm-hmm.
but you can blend. You could send the entire mix and then also send more of an individual channel. So it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like my whole mix and then also more of me, right?
Yep.
So let me just turn all these down. So imagine if I did this. If I have my main mix going to the queue,
Mm-hmm.
and that means that the artist is hearing whatever I'm hearing, but I also have the ability to add more of this channel in there, which is kind of like adding to what's already being fed to the queue.
Yep.
It's a
and
cool
then
workflow.
and then the thing to really know here is, remember back when we were in that first segment, we were talking about how ARM, it's automatically bypassing things so that the signal is getting to you as fast as possible. In this scenario, say, so we've got if you're using Q1 to send to your headphones to your musician, it's hearing the whole mix, and then now you input, you record ARM their lead vocal track. It's now bypassing that. It actually gets pulled out of what's being sent to the headphones. So
Right.
you could easily get in the scenario where like, cool, I'm hearing everything. All right, I want to punch this part. And they record enable them. If you don't have their vocal track also being sent to Q1, they're not going to hear themselves at all.
Right.
So you'd want to make sure that you and we even do this like on our live streams where sometimes you'll notice Fab messing with this on our Tales from the Switch, where like everything, most of the time it's all here on the main, and then you go to add a new track, he just has to remember to also send that to his queue to be able to listen to it.
Yeah. Yep.
Nice.
Yeah, and this might be a little tweaky, but you can actually feed these same cues from console as well. So if you had like system sound routed to virtual channels, you could actually include that in your cue mixes as well, for Spotify, YouTube playback, or whatever.
Yep, exactly. Cool. And that's the fun little secret that I think we'll kind of show a little bit more of this later too. But yeah, right now everything that we're doing in Luna, in the background, console, it's actually making moves inside a console for you that you're not seeing, that you're not having to go in and see or really control. But yeah, the two are just, they're intertwined together and working together to create whatever scenario and workflow that you're looking to do.
Yep.
Cool. So actually, if we think we're good here, then maybe now's a good time to throw it over to Matt real quick, just because everything, what I just showed you guys might seem a little daunting or whatever with these larger queue setups. But Matt is set up with a desktop device. So I'm gonna stop share on mine and let him take the screen for a sec to have a quick look at what some of this queue stuff looks like on a different system.
Yeah, right on. So I got an arrow here. So like Drew mentioned earlier, arrows just have the one cue, which is tied to the headphone output on the unit. So when you look at the cue section of mine, it's much smaller than Drew's. Instead of having the 4, I just have the one headphone cue. So everything that Drew described works exactly the same here. I can right click, copy to Q1. It'll copy the fader mix up here to the headphone cue. So it's pretty much just a very simplified version of exactly what Drew showed. If I look at my cue outputs panel, instead of the big matrix like Drew had, I just have the single cue, the headphone cue in this case, where I can, by default, the mix will be routed to it. I have it set up so that I can route signals to the headphones separately from the main mix. So yeah, it's not too complicated, exactly like Drew described, just scaled down really.
And then the twin would look similar, but also have that line 3 and 4 output as well.
Yeah. So on a twin, you'd see the headphone cue, but you'd also see one titled line 3/4, like Drew said. Works exactly the same as the other cues, except it's tied to the physical line 3/4 output on the back of the twin.
Cool. And then, as I mentioned earlier, which is maybe I think sometimes a lot of people don't know this, but that X4 with it has ADAT in and ADAT out. So everything I showed you with the fancy system and being able to mirror cues to ADAT and use them with like hearbacks and avioms, you can do that with an X4. So X4s can do 4 cues and they have that ADAT output. So that's really a pretty sophisticated desktop unit there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and Arthur in the chat here asked a good question of like the useful scenarios for cues on the Apollo Twin. Obviously, the headphone mixes, number one, but number two is that's a great way to get to the line 3/4. And actually, we've got a video coming out. It was a segment that we did during the Twin X and X4 launch. I don't know if you guys remember this. We had Tyler from the YouTube channel Music as Win. We did an example where we reamped a guitar in real time. So he was playing his guitar directly into an X4, and then by using this cue routing, we were able to send, with no latency, be able to send that signal back out a line output into a reamp box, into an amplifier, into an aux, back into the X4, and all that entire loop was all happening in real time. So we've actually got the evergreen, the forever version of that video we just uploaded to the channel, so it should be getting released this week or next week. Awesome. So that's another really good use if you have a twin or if you have an X4. The cue system gives you that access to line out 3 and 4 and allows you to route signals into it for creative processing purposes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let's let me grab the screen again and let's pick up where we left off, because I don't know where we're at. If we're halfway done, if we're I don't know. This is gonna be this is an epic one.
Real quick, Drew. There was a
Sure.
good question here from Victor of his main control room output switched from his Twin to his Silver Apollo, and he's got a studio wired. Can you just quickly show, because this is pretty important, and even like in your setup, where the order of your units matters. Because your blue one, having your X16 as your monitor, like that's what's connected to your monitors. If it accidentally ever gets moved around or misconfigured, this is the page to come to, right?
Yeah, for sure. So you can do this either from Luna and settings, or you can do it from console and settings. They are shared. These are shared settings, and I don't want to do it right now because it'll hose up my whole thing. But this is the order, right? This A, B, C, and D. And actually, I occasionally connect an X4, so you can see this X4 is grayed out there. But this is the page you would come to. This sequence matters, right? The A unit or the main unit, whatever is at the top, that's a special unit. That is the master unit. It's responsible for mon outs. So even though my twin on my desktop controls the monitors and it does the talkback and all of that, the actual audio pathways that are feeding my monitors all come off of the X16. And that A unit, it's monitor master, alt monitor master, it's clock master, it's where the cues come from. So it's a very special designation. So if you have a multi-unit system, then that A unit is special. And if for whatever reason, if you were to trash prefs or something during a troubleshooting process, that order could get messed up, and you just simply drag them, click and drag, right?
Yep, click and drag them around, and and I guess the only scenarios we've ever seen those really get jumbled up is like a trash prefs or like something goes wonky with your settings. Those will get hosed up, but it's super simple to just rearrange them back into the order that you have them connected.
Yeah, and you'll notice I have mine X8P-1. You can rename these. I renamed mine just to make sure there's not any confusion, and the naming that you do here carries forward into the driver, into the IO matrix. Of course, you also have a custom name, so you can see I've overridden I've overridden even these changed driver names to get these custom numbers. In some cases, I have them for mics. So these are all my unison inputs. But then I also have even just line inputs. You'll notice here I have some line inputs: Daking 1, 2, API, Neve 1 and 2. These are line inputs on my X16, which are options, by the way, which we didn't mention that, Ben, earlier. In these recording scenarios with Luna, when I you have the ability to when I come up here to the inputs, I have all of these mics, but you also have the ability to feed line level inputs if you have those in your units. This is great for external mic preamps that allow you to use whatever flavor you want, right?
Yep.
By the way,
And
speaking of the hardware tab, if you're doing that external mic preamps, you also have the ability in the hardware settings down here. You're going to want to bypass these here, the line input gains.
mhm.
So if you're using an external mic preamp and so it's doing the gain and the phantom and the phase and all that stuff, and you just want to bring a line level signal in. If you want the cleanest signal path, you can bypass the line input gains. This is only available on rack units. You can't do it on a twin or a desktop unit, but on the high end rack units, you can bypass that variable gain amplifier entirely, thereby shortening the signal path even more. Right?
Ah.
To bypass that.
That's really cool to know, and exactly, this is again, I love kind of telling stories from the Jakir and Cast session of, like, we were mixing everything, right? A little bit of unison preamps,
Yeah.
some stuff on the Focusrite console, some from that Neve sidecar they had in the room, kind of combining all these different types of sources. We're still, once it gets to Luna, they're all treated the same. So
Yep.
it's what record effects, and whether there's a unison slot available. But even when you're using those line ones, you can use record effects. I believe you can still flip
Yep.
phase. So you still get some controls over the sounds, and then you can obviously monitor through and treat them and send them out to the queues just like you would any other input.
Yeah, so here you can see when I switch this over to this Daking input, and I can choose between -10 and +4 of the line levels, and then I still have the record effects and everything there. So,
Mhm.
yeah, so this, Luna integrates with. I've seen guys online using Luna with consoles and feeding all line inputs and even line outputs, and basically treating Luna like a tape machine. You can do you can do a lot. You can do a lot of different things, a lot of different workflows.
Got a good question here of can you tell the correct position in Luna and of the DSP pairing? Um,
Well, yeah, so there is no correct position, right? The beauty of DSP pairing is that you're able to configure it as needed. So if you look at my unit,
mhm,
my setup, this is specific to me. This is the way I like it to work. My X16, which is my main unit, you'll notice I have it leaning towards virtuals, right?
mhm,
Because if you read or watch Matt's excellent video on DSP pairing, you'll know that there's a relationship between virtuals and DSP and channel DSP pairing, because channel DSP pairing actually uses virtual channels to connect the chips in series. Um, and so in my case, I personally, for the X16, the X16's main job is to bring line level signals in. So I'm not using heavy lift. I'm not using a lot of unison plugins and things like that. So I can have it lean towards the virtuals to give me the maximum number of virtuals. Whereas on my X8Ps, it's the exact opposite, right?
mhm,
These have 8 mic preamps, right? And 6 chips, as we mentioned earlier. So the goal here with the X8Ps is the opposite. I want lots of DSP pairs or more DSP pairs, and virtuals aren't as important because my main unit and other units are doing the virtuals. So
yeah,
really, the answer to the question is it's kind of, we purposely did it so that you could configure the system for however you see fit, right?
totally. And we got a good question here from Michael over on Facebook. Luna needs to be able to send the click down any output in Cascade. So right now it can only be used through the main unit. Will this ever make? Let's talk about the click to queue real quick.
Yeah, sure.
As
Yeah.
long as we're talking about queues, obviously one of the most important things to send to people's headphones is
Yeah.
the click track.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad they asked. I'm glad that they asked that question. And yeah, currently Luna, when in that record, in the record workflow popover, one of the buttons is click to queue, and you'll notice that a couple things. You have a power button up at the top, which is a global on-off button,
hmm
which is up here in the upper right-hand corner, and then on the left you have the monitor button, which is the click to the monitors.
Yep.
So That is toggled on and off with the 7 key on the numeric keypad, or with the GUI. And of course, you have volume control for that. And then you do have the ability to send to the 4 cues on, off, and at a given volume. And that the user is correct. It currently in Luna, the click's not fully routable, but that's a good example of something you'd want to hit that feedback button. Let the team know that you need that, just like you let them know you needed reverse, and let them know that you needed scrolling, because that's something that you can do as a workaround. I tell people, every day, you have a couple choices. You can just take a cue out and route it back to an input and record it in real time, or more easily just create a MIDI click with shape, if you need to export it. I don't know if you have any other suggestions for that user.
No, what you said is what I would say is like, yeah, even again, I think on the Shakir cast session, we ended up creating a click track in the session as an audio track, so that way we had a little bit more control over how and where it was going. Because one of the things you guys will notice, so Drew, when you hit 7 on your number pad, that's the shortcut to turn the click on and off. So you can see up in the main toolbar, the little metronome light is going on and off, but on the click to cue, it's only turning it on and off on the monitor. So this is really important. So, especially for headphone bleed purposes, right? Like if if the drummer took his headphones off, left them out in the live room, you thought you turned off the metronome, you may have click bleed all over the mics in the room. So especially for tracking, you just leave this open, right?
Yeah. Well, I either leave it open or submit feedback that the 7 key should do this.
Please, everybody is in that.
Yeah. Submit feedback that the 7 key should do the power button. That would be my take. I would prefer it to be that way, but
me too.
But yeah, okay. So so hit that feedback button.
Exactly. But in the meantime, leaving this window open, especially when you're in the tracking scenario, like it's been a while since I've done like a full tracking day, but stuff like this would be the type of windows that I would leave open and kind of at the ready while I'm sitting there engineering and staying connected to the musicians and being really aware of what they're hearing. And this would be the other thing I'd love to just quickly touch on, Drew, is that in the control room section of Luna, there's a couple buttons that we haven't addressed yet, and one of these that's super useful for this exact scenario is your source. So down there right now, you can switch between. You can. As the engineer, if you're in the control room, you can choose to listen to what's going out to those different cues, as well as your monitor.
Yeah, you'll notice I happen to this. In case you're wondering, I happen to be monitoring the cue. I have that as the source, but that's because of the way we have things set up, and I don't want to send my voice to the Zoom and to the stream twice. So typically, the source is going to be set to monitor for the speakers and for the control room. But yeah, as Ben said, it's super easy and it's very important. Like you can't just assume that the artist has a good headphone mix. At minimum, you're going to want to select the cue send and make it come out the speakers. For me, when I do sessions, before the vocalist even arrives, I'm in the booth. I can't sing, but I'm in the booth. I got the headphones on. I'm playing the track. I'm talking into the mic. I'm making sure that everything is exactly the way it should be. But yeah, so this is super handy to be able to choose your source and monitor what those cues are doing.
Nice. Great. And let's see, was there another question? Arna, he saw that you had 5 devices on your but you had that grayed out X4, and just to be clear, so that the console and the UAD software, it remembers whatever device you've connected to your chain devices. It'll remember them, and then if they're not plugged in, it'll stay there, so the setup persists, and when you plug that unit back in, you're not having to start all over again.
It's grayed out. I don't know if you can see on the stream, but the X4 is grayed out. And of course, I can click on it and hit remove, and it would hopefully not do anything to my setup. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. But anyway, yeah.
Famous last words.
Lost you.
Yeah.
Oh, he's back.
Oh.
No, it's rebuilding.
Let's see.
His
It's taking a second.
His mixer engine is thinking.
There we go.
Yeah,
Woo.
Congratulations.
Yeah. I almost got the Idiot of the Year award. Don't mess with that. Yeah. So yeah, there's your answer. That's
Hell
good.
yeah. Awesome. Great. So yeah, I think that answer,
We're going without a net here, people.
I
There's
know.
no
I
net.
love it. So yeah, I think that answers all the Q questions that I've been
so let's
seeing.
go to So next on my list is talkback, right? Which actually dovetails perfectly here. And there's not a ton of to talk about here, but let's go through it since this is a deep dive. We're going in the weeds. Ever since Twin Mark II, all Apollos have come with a built-in talkback, minus Aero. Aero is kind of meant to be a on-the-fly portable thing, and it's a little beyond the scope of the intent there. But everything from Twin Mark II on the X series rack units as well as X4 has the built-in talkback button, which of course is that little pinhole in the metalwork just under your volume knob, right? Maybe some people didn't know that. I don't know, but there it is. And it's a little omnidirectional microphone, and it is controlled via console. You'll notice it has its own strip. If you're not seeing this in Luna, then you can click on the control room button here in this monitor tab. And if you're not seeing the monitor tab, you need to come up here to the view button and show that, because it's possible to customize the GUI so you don't even see that. So I personally like to see the monitor, and I actually like to see the control room, just because I like to know it helps me to see what sources are, my trims and all that stuff. But anyway, so the talkback button, the talkback can be controlled either via the GUI or the button. And there's a couple modes of operation here. If you haven't dug into the manual, maybe you don't know this, but if you just quick click on the talk, it'll latch, right? If you click and hold, then it will be a momentary operation where the moment I let go, then it goes off, right? I'm going to do it, by the way, with the button now on the hardware. Quick click latches, and press and hold is momentary.
Nice.
You have a volume control here, and you even have inserts, right? So the talkback has the ability to have plugins put on it, right?
If you really want to warm up, if you really want to warm it up or de-ess it,
Right. If you wanted to, you could do whatever you want to. You could do a pitch shifter on your voice, or to scare the talent, or I don't know, whatever you're gonna do.
If you especially like if you're gonna sing, all joking aside, a practical purpose, like say you're vocal coaching, and you can put autotune on there. You can so that way whatever you sing to them can be perfectly in key, so that way they're not hearing me singing badly.
Yeah, right. And by the way, so you have the ability to do that. You have inserts that are available on them, and you can even show you can even go into the talkback, like say on the Twin X, and the talkback is available as I/O, right? So Luna doesn't see that just yet, but at some point in the future, it very well might. But third-party DAWs will see that talkback as a viable input. For if you're a singer-songwriter, if you're working on something, you don't have a mic connected, but you've got this killer melody in your mind, right? If you do a quick press on the talkback, it'll bring that talkback alive. You arm a track with that as its input. You can hum it in. You could strum, acoustic guitar chord progression that's in your mind. You could literally use the talkback mic as a scratch pad when you don't to record ideas when you don't have that going. So
nice.
So it's got the inserts. It's available in the I/O, and then of course you have a talkback popover. Here you have from left to right, you've got the ability to send the talkback to the monitor. So imagine that scenario I described earlier, where you haven't bothered to make a cue mix. You're just sending the main mix to the artist, but they're still in the booth. You still got to be able to hear them, be able to communicate with them, so you can talk back to the monitor. Be careful there. You don't want to have the monitors blasting. You could get some feedback, even depending on your dim settings. And then of course, talkback on and off to the various cues, right? If it's the drummer, then it's that, right? The drummer, drummers are typically deaf, right? So you got to blast them with the talkback, so they can hear it. But so not much. That's about all there is to say on the talkback. It's a utility piece. It's built into each Apollo, but there is some cool features. The idea that you can put effects on them, the idea that they are routable. To do some clever little things with them.
Nice.
So yeah, I think that about covers talkback. I'm sure the chat's probably not going to light up too much on the talkback, but
no, not too much. There was just questions about which units have talkback built into them.
So that would be Twin Mark II is the first to get it. So it's basically Twin Mark II and newer minus Aero.
Yeah,
that's kind of the easy way to say it. So, but
so
even the rack units.
So all the X series units have it. The Twin Mark II, the X4, the Twin X, they all have talkback built into them.
And interestingly, the driver's smart. So even though my system, I have all of these X series have them, but the driver knows that the chances are the Twin is on the desktop. So it automatically makes the Twin the talkback.
can you move that around? So say you had your twin in the back of the room and you actually wanted to use your rack as the talkback. Is there a way to
Yeah, I don't
force
think
that?
there is. I don't think there is. I try, when I try and drag that, Matt, you might know. I don't know if that. I don't think there is. I think the twin takes that role and kind of latches onto it, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
Matt,
that's right. Whenever there's a
yeah.
twin, it takes over as the talkback device.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
makes sense.
yeah, that it's a kind of baked in. That logic is baked into the driver.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, guess what?
Um,
Yeah, and then just got a question here over on Facebook from Josh. Have you already talked about the submix concept yet? We haven't yet. What a great getting into auxes and
Yeah,
how
yeah.
ARM so we've kind of skipped around. We talked about how on the input side how it works. We've talked about how it works on cues, how it works on a big system, how it works on a small system, how it
Yeah.
works using the built-in headphones, how it works using a headphone system. So we're circling around, and now this is where it can get fun and creative again. From a obviously on the input side you can add input effects and you can there's a lot of tone shaping possibilities there. But then think about when you're recording a vocalist or a guitarist, like what do they want? They want some effects. They want some
right.
they want to be sitting in some sauce.
Some zhuzh.
Exactly. It's no fun to just record dry.
Yeah.
Especially when you've got incredible sounds available to you. So ARM also extends to beyond cues. It does extend to some aux stuff. So
Sure.
let's show the people what we got.
Yeah, so let me shift the focus from the drums part of the session. Let's come over here to the vocal part of the session, but obviously everything we're about to describe could apply to any tracks, but I just happen to have it set up over here on these vocal tracks. I've pre-made some effects, right? Verb 1, delay, and then I also have this a Valhalla, a native process here so that we can see these as well. And so buses, right? Buses are used for submixes, but they're also used for effects. The specific scenario we're going to talk about here is in an effect scenario. So Luna uses consoles to auxes, and they're dynamically allocatable to a given bus. So if you look down here, when you look at these buses, you'll notice some different color coding in these ARM buttons. Buses basically can be in one of three states. You'll notice that this Valhalla bus is the ARM button is a black button with gray letters. That means that it's unassigned, right, to one of the two armed auxes. And in fact, this one can't be assigned because, oh, by the way, I just made my faders little, if you were wondering about that. And then I spilled accidentally. So a little bit of gooey madness. Yeah, a little bit of gooey madness. So a bus can either be unassigned, right? So if I hit none, then you get this behavior and this visual that it's grayed out and it's unassigned. If I click on it and assign it to one of the two auxes, one of two consoles, two auxes, then it turns the black button with the orange, and then this one I can move over to number 2. So basically you have two effects that at any given time can be designated as one of your two ARM enabled aux buses. What's cool about this is this now moves these buses and their effects into the DSP live DSP path, right? So let's say I come over here to my lead vocal, and let me just that's plugged into a mic. I've got a mic input. So watch what happens when I arm this aux, and you'll notice that I specifically have this vocal being sent to the three different effects that I have built. And so when I arm this track, you'll notice that the two DSP based, the two ARM enabled auxes change their color yet again to this full gold shading, because what that's telling me is that not only are they assigned to one of the armed auxes, but they actually have active audio sending to them. So for example, if I were to come over here and I were to kill this feed, you would notice that this aux, the delay aux, now reverts back to its previous. It's telling you that it is ARM enabled, but it doesn't have any active audio being sent to it. The moment I come back over here and I resend something to it, it changes back over. The moment I unarm the track, then they go back to being their designated state, but not active, right? So hopefully that's making sense. Furthermore, you'll also notice that my AU bus, or send rather, that is sending to a bus, this guy grays out entirely because, again, the whole point of ARM is to stay in the DSP realm, to stay super quick, super low latency. And, AU plugins just can't give you that experience.
Yeah.
So you're able to freely adjust them. So let's say I go to switch over to do a guitar overdub or something, and all of a sudden I want this guitar effects now to become one of my arm auxes. I'm free to come over here and do that, and it will automatically, Luna will steal one of the arm auxes away from that. And then if I come back to doing vocals later, I'm free to kind of steal that back, so I can sort of direct Luna's attention to wherever it needs to go.
And this is, and I'm sure the obvious question, right, is like, why are there only 2? Why can't I have 4, 5, 6 of these? And again, this relates back to what we were talking about earlier. This is all processing happening inside of your Apollo. So there's a finite, just like in a studio, the patch bay only has so many patch points. There's a finite number of real-time auxes that are available in Luna at the moment. So it's a resource that you have to balance, just like DSP.
Yeah.
And obviously it's also using DSP as well. So like there's multiple things that you had to factor in here. It's not just this unlimited world where you can throw anything at anything. It is,
how many 480s do you have in your studio, Glenn? Ben, rather.
Exactly.
You're lucky if you have one, right?
You're lucky if you have one. Exactly.
Yeah.
So it really does emulate kind of the real world scenarios that people, that most analog studios also experience, and that's not the reason why we do it that way, but it is because the only thing that we care about is a low latency experience. It is, again, if you're going to send to effects, don't send to effects and have them be completely out of time and have them kind of smearing the whole image, or especially like if you're using it for things besides reverb and delay, which are time, with those, like latency doesn't feel like it's as important. But if you're going to do dynamics or saturation or any other sort of effect, if there was latency there, you would super notice it, and it'd affect the performance.
Yeah, it's good that you brought it up, Ben, because they're actually just so you do know that there is a little bit of latency. I think, what is it, Matt? 32 samples in this. So you wouldn't want to use this for parallel processing. Although we will show you later in the stream that a way around that. There's a couple when we get into some of the deeper dives. By the way, I can just, if I arm this track and I switch over to console, you can see, what Ben just said. You can see evidence that they get built, right? And then when I unarm the track and they go back to that state back in console, they're gone. Right.
Yeah.
So,
and that's the cool thing. We've had console hiding there in the background the whole time, but you can notice, everything that Drew's doing right now, Luna is doing some magic in the background, saying, "Hey, console, put these on channel 3, put these on the 2 auxes, route this, send this to the queues." Luna and console are working together to do this low latency experience.
Yeah, and you don't have to have it open, and you don't have to look at it. Like, don't let that, if that throws you. I'm only doing it for illustrative purposes here, to just sort of drive home the technical, the deep dive, right?
Totally. But if people say, I've seen a few people where they have had both of them open, and then they go into console and they start changing things. Does that put you can that potentially break things or get into a weird space if you come over here and start changing things?
God, I don't know. I honestly haven't tried that. Have you tried that, Matt? Have you tried it, Ben? I'm not sure. I would imagine, I would say it's frowned upon. Maybe, I don't know.
I don't think it's recommended. But I haven't.
Let's see what happens.
Myself.
I mean, I'm gonna come in Luna if I change it, and then I go back to console. It sees it. If I change it in console, Luna sees it. So hey, so
changes definitely translate. I wonder if I'm pretty sure loading a plugin in console works the same way. It's a two-way communication going there.
It's not, or it is.
It is, yeah.
It is, okay, yeah. So I'm not sure that I don't know that you need to do that. Although when we get into our discussions of console tracking mode, then we might find there might be some scenarios there where we discuss people who have previously existing console sessions that want to bring them into Luna. So maybe we'll save that for that discussion.
I got a good question here from Arthur. So why wouldn't, say you're tracking vocals, why not just add the reverb as an insert for tracking vocals instead of routing to an aux?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I answer this all the time, and there's lots of really good reasons. Number one is that the moment you do that, your reverb's now mono. Number one. So that's bad. That's strike number one. Number two, you now have taken control of your reverb amount and buried it in the GUI of a plugin. Number two. Number three, and probably the most important one that a lot of people don't realize, is that a wet dry knob in a reverb is not an amount. In other words, it is a reciprocal level control.
Mm-hmm.
As you dry it up, you're increasing. As you dry it up, you're decreasing the level of the reverb and increasing the dry signal. And when you do the reverse, you're decreasing the dry signal and increasing the wet signal. In other words, it's not. You're actually changing the relationship between the wet and dry, not just adjusting the levels. Whereas putting it on a send, number one, it's stereo. Number two, it's being able to be shared by multiple channels. And number three, and I don't know if you guys can see my hands very well, but what happens is dry signal stays and wet goes up and down,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to this, right? This is a moving target. You're constantly, as you wet and dry it, you're constantly altering the relationship between the two. What you want is dry and then wet.
Yep.
Right. So hopefully that's making sense. But
yeah.
those are the reasons why it's almost never a good idea to insert time-based effects like reverb.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's such a good point, and it's also the head start towards the mixing process. And I don't know about you guys, but like when I'm working on a project, like even though we're at the beginning stage of a song or a session, like we're always trying to think like, I'm trying to give myself head starts and getting towards a finished product, and some of that includes like trying out different reverbs in the tracking phase and really trying to see like, is this fitting the song? Am I getting the sound that I want as the artist? Are they reacting to this? And then potentially changing that. But often like the reverb that ends up in the final mix on a project that I've tracked, it was decided on the tracking day, like the preset and the four, and maybe I'll tweak it a little bit, maybe shorten it, or I'll re-listen to it and make sure that it's still the right thing. But the sound that inspired the performance, to me it's always really critical to kind of connect those two together.
Yeah, and
yeah, totally.
I think I might have mentioned, imagine if you have 4 or 8 vocals, if you're inserting the reverb, you're now using 4 or 8 plugins when you really only need to use one. Right?
Mm-hmm.
But I encourage users to do that experiment. Insert a reverb on a vocal in a track, and then adjust the wet and dry mix, and the vocal will go like this. It'll go backwards and forwards in depth and volume at the same time, which you just would never want to do in that case. So
we gotta, maybe we'll come back to this question later, but I just want to make sure. So Danielle is asking if there's a reason for using the sync mode in the Ampex ATR 102 on the mains. I've heard having the Ampex in sync mode for mixing helps in some way, but she didn't quite understand the concept 100%.
Well, the idea that what the sync mode on a tape machine is emulating is tape machines have 3 heads: erase, record, and reproduce, or ERP or whatever. Mm-hmm. And sync mode, and they do well with not getting into a lot of detail there, but like sync mode is using the record head as a playback head, and sync mode is what you needed to use in order to have your overdubs line up with the previously existing stuff. But the record head acting as a playback head had slightly less fidelity than the dedicated playback or repro head. But the repro head had more delay. So what she might be referring to is the idea that in sync mode, there might be less latency on that plugin. I actually haven't tried it because, frankly, using the ATR in sync mode means you're not hearing the tape effect. Yeah. You're only hearing the electronics. Mm-hmm. So for me, the ATR 102, I would never run it in anything but repro mode, because repro mode is as if the music is coming off tape, coming off the repro head. So that might be what she's thinking of.
That makes sense. Yeah, and we got a request here from Marcus to talk about analog summing setups. So it's a little outside what we're talking about here for ARM today, but that's a topic that we're for sure we're going to do one of these deep dives around that.
Yeah. We're really keeping our eye on that subject, for sure.
Exactly. So guys, these are great questions, and just need info about arming the verb bus. Yeah, that's awesome. Cool. Yeah, man. So that's the basic setup. And is it always? I have a question though. As we were showing the arm button, how you have to assign it to aux 1 or aux 2. Is that something you always had to manually specify, or does it automatically follow? So say you go to that guitar track where you've got guitar effects, does it automatically pull that aux into arm mode for you or not?
Yeah, let's see. So if I arm this track, Luna does not.
Gotcha.
Right? So I'm having to do that. Yeah.
Cool.
So that's a cool. Of course, in a session from scratch, it'll auto assign the first bus to arm 1 and the second bus to arm 2. But then beyond that, then you're in control of what you want it to do. Mm-hmm. But hey, that's not a bad feature request, Ben, right? Wouldn't that be cool if Luna was like smart enough to say, hey, you've armed this track. this track is associated with that bus. Why don't we auto switch, right? So that's,
Mm-hmm.
I think you got a good idea there.
I think I got a good piece of feedback I'll share later.
Yeah, I think so too.
Nice.
Okay, so I think, did we feel like we've covered this idea of these ARM auxes? Like this the color coding, all of that workflow that we just sort of talked about, like that's something that like I feel like I see people talking about on a day-to-day basis. So hopefully we covered that well. Any other things you guys would add?
Well, Cody's asking some good questions here about how, like, is there a way to commit to this stereo bus processing? So like, say you have a reverb like Ocean Way, and you love the sound of it, and you want to save your DSP by committing that, what you've sent over into Ocean Way. Is there a way to record the output of one of these auxes in real time?
Yeah, you could do. You could simply, if you set this aux to pre-fader and muted the original, and then if I bounced or did mix down feet, then I would with that soloed, right, but muted, then the output of that processor, whatever bus I'm sending it to, could be printed on its own. And in fact, you might not even need to do that. You might even just be able to go to the mix down pane
Mm-hmm.
and choose that bus and
Yeah.
just bounce that bus, and that would be it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great way about Luna is that you can choose, you can bounce not just your output or not just the individual tracks, but you can choose to bounce an entire bus for those savings. But yeah, doing it in real time using virtual channels, the thing that you wouldn't be able to do is you can't assign an output. Like you couldn't say the output of verb 1, I want that to go to virtual 1 2 and then record virtual 1 2, and it wouldn't all happen all real time, no latency.
The virtuals are not delay compensated, so you want to be careful about how you use virtuals. The virtuals are kind of like a little utility kind of a thing.
Yeah, they give you the lowest latency possible always, but the converse of that is they don't compensate for delay. So if you try to print them back in, they typically end up early because they're not being compensated.
Yeah, right. So, but yeah, that mix down feature, that would be the simplest way. Just simply go over here, select the bus you want, and knock it down, and that would get you just the wet signal into a stereo file, drag it back in, and you're done.
Yeah, that's the best way. Kind of a minor point about the aux buses I just thought of, since you have Neve summing loaded on them. When you put the aux buses into, or sorry, when you put like a Luna bus into that ARM mode, even though you have Neve summing loaded on it, you're not actually going to hear that Neve summing, right? Because that's a
good point.
Process.
Yeah, good point. That goes back to what we said earlier about anything ARM related is always DSP. So yeah, anything that's native, which is all Luna extensions, are always native, and yeah, including the summing and tape would not be a part of that.
And so, like when you arm your vocal track and when you're activating the arm on those verb and delays, I think it shows you visually, right? The Neves are kind of darkened. Yep.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and you'll see, but I believe in one of the, I can't remember, it was 104 or 105. One of those updates, they activate it so the meters will still move, even though it's deactivated, since those don't have to be perfectly delay compensated.
Right.
But yeah, the same thing. I guess we've kind of, just for sake of visual purposes, we've hidden the tape, the Studer and Oxide tape area of all your tracks. We've had that kind of hidden this whole time, but that's an important note. Thanks for bringing it up, Matt. Yeah, when you record, enable a track, it's going to bypass the tape extensions. It's going to bypass the Neve extensions. Any of those native processes, including AU plugins and extensions, those are all automatically taken out of the equation while you're tracking. And then the moment you go to playback, now they're brought back to life automatically.
One thing that Matt always says is that, like, ARM basically bypasses the computer entirely, right? That's like a good way to think about it. It's tough to visualize because you're looking at it on screen and your brain is telling you it's right there. Why, but once you get your head around the idea that it's bypassing that for the sake of latency, then it all kind of falls into place.
There's
a lot to it, but it's essentially hardware monitoring. And when you're in these ARM modes, Luna just becomes the control software for what's happening inside the DSP. So that's a helpful way to think about it.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and again, it was fun during our cast session with Shakir. Like one of the big comments that he had as we were doing that session was, so you're recording. We had 20 some, almost 30 tracks, all record enabled, monitoring live, listen to the band. The band did a take all together. It's bypassed all the studers. It bypassed all this stuff. But it actually ended up being a really cool thing because then when the musicians came into the control room and he hit play, now they're hearing it. Now, they've been hearing it live, just directly monitored as fast as possible, right? It didn't have
Mm-hmm.
that tape color, or any of the Neve color added to it. And so now the instant you hit playback after a take, those now they get the Studer and the Neve were activated, and then you
Yeah.
hear it back, but you hear it back off tape and through Neve, and it instantly just it made
Yeah.
everything just sonically jump that much further off the page, and it gave them that, like, it's an analog experience, because that would be the same workflow if you were using a physical console and a physical tape machine. You
Yep.
record in, you're monitoring off the console while you're doing the take, and then you rewind the tape, move over into repro mode, boom, hit on the tape. Now you're monitoring off a tape,
Yeah.
and you get that little extra sense of tape and sound and warmth for the playback. That is just it's an unmistakable difference in tone and sound.
Yeah, I remember those days. You'd spend 2, 3, 4, 6 hours setting up, and the entire time you've got the tape machine on input, and it's just passing signal, right? And you're hearing the electronics of the tape machine, but that's it, right? By the way, the ATR 102, you can, that's what we were talking about before there. And then, yeah, you're getting sounds and you're having everything come together. You hit record, you're still monitoring input. You're monitoring input, and only when you hit playback do you actually hear the impact of tape. So it's kind of replicating that workflow. It's cool.
Yeah, Daniel, I'll say, people's faces are great when they hear the first playback. That it is one of my favorite things to see now. Is like when people first hear it, you're just like, they're like, well, I did that. Like that's what it sounded like. That sounds so good. Like,
Yeah.
it's that head start that you're really looking for.
The tape and summing is, I think it's instantly 20% less mixing, right? It's like you need 20% less processing right off the bat. So like if you're doing a mix in Luna, import your multi-track, assign things to groups, and like normally I wouldn't have done that first, but Luna has changed the way I work. I now do that first. I tend to do that stuff first, whereas I might not have in another DAW.
Mm-hmm. And we're about to have a user revolt over the size of your mouse, Drew.
Yeah, I was gonna address that.
What about? I can do that shaky thing where it makes it big, but I don't know.
We'll try to figure something out for a future video.
Yeah.
Nothing we can do now, though.
Yeah, sorry.
Don't worry, guys. We are seeing what you're saying, and yes,
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah. Well, and if you're watching on your phone, or like, make sure you're rewatch it on a big monitor where you can go full screen. I think that's probably going to be helpful if in case that's not the case right now.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are really liking this and wondering if it's going to be available after the live stream. And yes, it will be available on our YouTube channel. So check that out.
Yep.
And I guess the plan is, we'll be potentially making some condensed versions of this as well.
Exactly. Yeah, you guys are all our guinea pigs as we were refining the outline and the script, and then we'll turn this into some Luna Basics videos that are a little short and concise, but based on this exact same information. So we figured it'd be kind of it's a fun way to do it live and get you guys the information as fast as possible, but also for us to make sure we're hitting all the topics and getting your guys' feedback and questions in real time is helping shape what we're going to put into these future Luna Basics videos.
Yep.
So yeah, this is great.
Awesome. Okay, so I guess I have only let's shall we keep going, Ben?
Let's keep rolling.
We're an hour and 40. Let's keep going. All right.
Yeah.
So now now that we've talked about those buses, let's talk about. I want to talk about a couple of different. Now we're getting super sort of really in the weeds, as if we weren't already. But I want to show you a couple of unique workflows that involve ARM. They're ARM related because we're talking about these buses. And so I'm going to move over here to the left-hand side of the session. I've got a couple of tracks set up for you, and I'm going to show you basically maybe three different little scenarios that might work out for you. So we have a couple of plugins. This is a workflow I see a lot of people wanting to do, right? You plug a guitar in, you plug a bass in, and or a synth or whatever, and it's mono, right? You've got this mono source, and you would like to sort of widen it, make it more juicy and a little more wide, that kind of a thing. One of the people's favorite tools for this, and I'm with you here. This is like, this is like, one of the must-haves if there aren't enough of them already. So imagine, I see a lot of guitar players love this because this, if you're a guitar player, or especially if you have aux, right, and you've gotten spoiled by how beautiful aux sounds and how its rooms sound. Aux's technology is partially derived from what we did here with Ocean Way. So I see a lot of guitar players wanting to do this. So imagine this. Imagine we have a mono guitar input, right? And I've got it set up here. This is labeled mic 9, but I have a guitar cable plugged in, so it'll switch to the high Z. And so I'm going to arm this track, and this, you can now see that I happen to have an amp simulator on there, and this is a mono signal, right? And it sounds great, but if I want to zhuzh it up a little bit, I can use an Ocean Way plugin and make that one of my armed auxes and send to that. I might even want to check this out. If you want to really sort of create the experience, right? I could just run it full wet, right? And have it just be a typical sort of parallel send, or send and return thing. Or I could mute the original and make it pre-fader and then adjust the amount here. And then I can kind of just keep everything inside of one GUI if I wanted to. That's one scenario that I see people wanting to do. Another scenario, if I remove that, utilizing that same setup, we have this wonderful Fender 55 plugin that is one of the unique plugins on our platform, in that it's unison, but it's also stereo. And those two things don't typically jive, right? Unison is, on a single channel, and you're plugging in a single mono guitar, but yet this plugin is stereo. So utilizing that same configuration, this enables me to plug in. Maybe I don't want an amp sim here, right? Instead,
so now you're kind of recording, basically almost kind of like recording a dry, it's almost like you're recording the guitar DI without an amp model on it, right? So you've just now you've got a distortion pedal, so you've got something that's at least setting up the unison slot, so that way you're getting the impedance matching of a pedal or an amp. But the signal that you're actually going to capture here is just dry, spanky, clean guitar, but it's getting fed. You're feeding it pre-fader into the stereo aux that's armed. So now your Fender is now you've got stereo capabilities.
Yeah, right. So what I've done here, and the pedal is really only serving the pedal. You could absolutely have the pedal be active and have it become a part of the tone. But if I bypass it, a unison distortion pedal bypassed will give me the impedance matching and the gain level. So I takes the guesswork out of that. But since I bypassed it, I still get a clean sound.
You can actually do the same thing by loading the Fender in the unison slot and switching off the amp. It still does the impedance interaction. Yeah,
that one's just a lot more DSP.
A lot more DSP for sure. Yeah.
So the TS overdrive is kind of the low DSP way of doing that. But the beauty, so what you wind up with here is, just to recap. I have a high Z input. The TS overdrive is inserted for unison purposes, but bypassed, so it's not impacting the tone. That signal is being recorded, as Ben mentioned. It's being recorded to this track with absolutely nothing on it. It's pure, clean DI. I can do whatever I want with it after the fact, but live, but I've got it muted, and then I've got a pre-fader send to an ARM-enabled aux with the Fender on it. And hopefully you guys can see this here, but I've got the mics are panned left and right. That's the whole end game here. The whole end game here is to get this Fender guy in stereo with the different mics left and right. So whether it's the Fender and using this trick, or if it's using Ocean Way as as your sort of stereoizer, like this workflow is great for that.
Can you run a Fender 55 and Ocean Way at the same time, or does that kind of reach a DSP limit?
I don't know. Let's see. Let's try it. Why not? Let's live
Fender
on the edge.
uses a lot of DSP and Ocean Way uses a lot of PGM, so you might be able to squeak by.
Let's see. I'm getting a little.
Try going, one slot below.
Yeah, let's see.
Oh yeah, we had this problem the other day.
So let's see what happens. Nope.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, there are some limits. These are two of our heaviest ones.
If you had DSP pairing enabled, maybe.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. So, this is a great example of how to, some of the powerful and some of the creative routing stuff that you can do. And again, now that these are both set up, if you record a take, you can then, after the fact, change your guitar amp model, and it's may feel like it's against the committing to a sound thing, but it's committing it's what some of us like to do, and there are some advantages to doing it that way. But at the same time, this whole system is built to be as flexible as possible for any workflow that anybody wants to approach. And a lot of times, I know plenty of guitar players who don't like to commit completely, especially to a plug-in tone. Like they may just want something to like, all right, let me get the part, let me get my performance with something that I like, but I want to spend 5 more weeks tweaking that tone. So this is a great way to have that ability to tweak until you fall.
Yeah. So
asleep.
the next thing, the next one is a similar workflow. This is definitely an edge case here. But let's run through it. So the idea here is imagine there's a couple scenarios that we can imagine here. Some people imagine you're tracking drums, right? And we have all of these drums. We have all of these drum tracks. And typically, if I were to, as I did earlier at the beginning, if I were to arm these, each one of these individual tracks that I have armed would go to the cues and monitors as individual elements, right? But imagine if you wanted to record them, but monitor them in both the monitors and the cues with processing as a group, right? How could this be accomplished? So this guy here, so I'm going to take my drums and I am going to utilize a little shortcut that some people might not be aware of. Earlier we right clicked on the fader, but if we right click on the pan knob, we get a second set of copy mix 2, and this time it sends. So I'm going to use send 2. And first of all, let me assign them first. So let me go up here and go to the assignment, and I'm going to go to the drums, right? So I'm going to assign all of my drums, and actually, since I did the copy to it, already did them. But so if I assign them,
even though you're clicking the pan knob, it is actually copying the fader level, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. You happen to be, if I click copy to send on the pan knob, it's doing fader level, exactly. And I guess that the idea there is that we needed to differentiate between cues down here and sends up here.
Yep.
So now I have all of my drums. I have my drum mix copied to some sends. I'm going to pre-fader those sends, and I'm going to mute the initial feeds to the monitors. Now, this might seem counterintuitive, but what's happening now is that my drums are, and actually, let me go ahead and now arm the tracks. There we go. So now, Luna had to build a bunch of stuff right there. So now what I've got is I now have my drum tracks they're armed, and they're recording each individual channel to each individual track. However, over here on my drums, if I make my drum submaster or my drum mix one of the ARM enabled auxes, you will notice that I now have the ability to send my live drums through an EQ, through a distressor, which, by the way, has your parallel compression. So here I am tracking drums. Each mic is going to its own track with whatever processing I want. And live in real time, I am monitoring the submix of these drums with EQ and parallel compression on them. And I can send them to the various cues as I see fit. So this is a pretty crazy, pretty advanced workflow that you'd be hard pressed to make this happen on any other platform. I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't even know if anyone else can do this, but it's a pretty advanced workflow. It's a relatively advanced multi-step process here, but it's it's there to make it happen.
We had a question over on Facebook a little while, 20 minutes ago. So Josh was kind of asking about using this real-time monitoring in a live setting for, say, like live streaming. If you wanted to be able to do a live mix like this and still keep everything in that low latency experience, this is the sort of trick that you could use. You could set up a submaster,
absolutely,
take all the tracks in your session, have them all go into an aux like what Drew just showed here, and then do any sort of processing that you like on those. The key to the trick is using the ARM enabled sends as opposed to the main faders to control the level and the sending over there. But again, I guess you could probably, Drew, you showed the feature of like being able to copy your mix up there. In theory, you could do or I guess because you have to mute those main faders, so no matter what, you would need to have those up in pre-fader. But then this would be a good scenario for taking that send, and instead of using the little knob, you can expand that little knob and actually show a full fader for that send. So now it's very similar. I relate to this as like this feels like the SSL sort of like big fader, small fader sort of scenario where you get your big faders or like your big monitor mix, but then you can use these small faders to send a slightly different feed to to like a camera or to an OBS or something like that.
Yep. Yeah, you could. It's almost like these are kind of your input fader, or the input faders, and then these are like being fed off of that, like matrix outs almost, or like small faders that are tapping into the output of the large fader.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then and especially this combined with cues, right? Because now that drum, to be able to send that parallel compressed drum to the drummer.
Yeah.
There you go. Now you use Q instead of using Q1 on the individual tracks. Using Q1 on that
all
aux.
of these are down. Yeah, all of these need to be down because I don't want to send any of the uncompressed drums to the headphones. All of these are down, and the only thing going to the headphones is my EQ'd and compressed, and in this case, parallel compressed mix of the drums. So
yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. What a cool, these are really tweaky. These are, these are pretty advanced workflows that we're showing you guys here, but but we know that we've had, even ourselves, like we've wanted to do these things in recording scenarios. So, it's good to show these kind of really advanced and kind of tweaky workflows as well as the basic stuff that we were covering earlier.
Yeah, so now,
speaking of tweaky, right?
Yeah. So now we're gonna enter into another segment that we have planned here for you guys, and that is console tracking mode. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hit undo a few times in order to get out of. Yeah, I'm gonna get out of this. Get out of the sends, this whole send business, right? So I'm just gonna keep hitting undo until that stuff goes away. And I'm going to take the load off of Luna, get those tracks unarmed, and get us back to this state. So what we want to talk about now is let's talk about console tracking mode, right? I've made references to it a few times throughout this at the beginning, and we've said that you probably want to be working most of the time. You want to be working with console tracking mode off, but let's look at the differences and what console tracking mode offers. So at the very beginning, for those of you who have stayed with us this entire time, at the very beginning, you might have noticed that I early on I switched over to console to show you the fact that all of it was muted, right? All of console is muted, and that's that's the essence of Luna and the way it interacts with console. With console tracking mode off, Luna basically takes over console. And for most users, that's going to be a desirable thing, right? Console sort of goes away into the background, Luna takes over, and that's where you get your various advantages like arming a track. And look at what Luna does. It builds and remembers and stores and recalls a pathway for me, right? And when I select the same mic input on a different track and I arm it, Luna builds a unique path for that channel as well. But there are some certain scenarios where you might not want this to be the case, right? Imagine you're doing background vocals and you've got one mic in the studio, but you're stacking up 10, 12, 14 tracks of background vocals. So imagine these are all background vocal tracks. You just want to have the same exact input path, the same pathway feeding all of those tracks. And you're just going to, knock out your vocal stacks. So this is going to be really quickly done with console tracking mode off. So first of all, let me turn it on. Mm-hmm. And the first thing you'll notice when you turn on console tracking mode is that if I go back to console, everything that it auto muted is now unmuted, right? Mm-hmm. Including my voice. Probably you're hearing it twice now. So that's first and foremost. First and foremost, console tracking mode puts puts Luna into a mode where it's no longer taking over console for you. It's not going to auto mute them. This has some advantages of making your signal always be persistent, so vocalists can hear themselves even in between sessions. Guitar players can be tuning and listening and rehearsing without you having any tracks armed and without having any tracks set to input, right? So those are a couple of things.
Well, and if you've been using console for any time before Luna came out, it's basically it's that experience. It's the
Exactly,
same
yeah.
experience as using console with Logic or console with Pro Tools. Like you're now operating in two different domains where you have console responsible for your real time processing, your cue assignment, like all that sort of stuff is now
The
handled in
live
console.
inputs, yeah.
Yep, exactly. And then Luna is here just to be the recording station for it.
Yeah, so now notice the difference in this scenario now. Console tracking mode is on. I don't have anything armed and I don't have any tracks set to input, and yet all of my inputs in console are open and active. So singers are hearing themselves and guitar players are hearing themselves and so forth. When it does come time to record, I'm going to arm this track, and you will notice something different has happened. Luna did not take over console.
Yeah.
And console is I'm now free to build whatever input I want, right? So let's say I want the 1084 on this one. So I'm going to do that. And let's just say my favorite trick, come up, add some stuff, click on the 10, get you -10, and a little high pass for a vocal, whatever. I can record with that all day long. So now I lay down this one background vocal track, being fed by mic input 2. The singer nails it, and we're ready to stack up the doubles. So I go to the next track, I arm it, and lo and behold, the same exact input path I just built previously is now still there. I can stack that up. I go to the next track, and I feed it from the same mic input 2. I arm that track, and again, the 1084 is presented there. So you get the idea, on and on. So this is a different way of working. It's just like, as Ben mentioned, it's exactly the old school, the old Apollo way, right? Where console is console, and you can, Luna's not going to mess with you, right? This is also really useful for people. There's a lot of people out there with lots of console sessions, right? If you have a bunch of old console sessions, you want to load them up and take advantage of those input channels that you've built up. You can then, put it in console tracking mode, and Luna won't overtake those channels, and you can use all of your old setups. So that's the first benefit of console. By the way, if you want to take it one step further, there's a feature called isolate. You might have noticed in Ben, if you've ever seen Ben's console or Matt's console, you'll notice that we have several channels where we're isolating them. I have the mic I talk with isolated. I have my aux return and my OS return. They're isolated as well. So if you want to take that one step further, where Luna can't mess, and console can't even mess with a channel, you can put it in isolate mode. That's kind of not really related to ARM, but I figured I'd mention it anyway. Now the second aspect of console tracking mode is that this is a special thing where it has to do with the cues. And one of the things that people have enjoyed for the last 8 years that Apollo's been around is the ability to hear DAW playback and live input in the cues, right?
Yeah.
And I know when Luna first came out, like a lot of people were like, "Hey, what happened to my the live input during pre-roll and during post-roll?" And console tracking mode now has that feature. So this is the second primary benefit of console tracking mode. Is it's not something I can really demonstrate now because it has to do with the cues and all that. It's not easily demonstrable, but that's what when you turn on console tracking mode, not only will you have the ability to Luna not taking over your console channels and not muting them and have persistent inputs, but you also get in the cues and in the monitors, you get a blend of live input and playback audio. So this is great for singers who during pre-roll, they need to hear themselves to find their note and get where they're going to be and do all that. So console tracking mode is really good for that. So,
and so how's console tracking mode? How's that kind of different than using the input monitor function inside of Luna?
Yeah, so the input button inside of Luna is a great feature, and it's a good way to get Luna to pull in a signal without actually having to arm or record a track, right? So for example, if I arm a track, right, Luna will not only arm the track, but basically put it in input mode and allow signal to pass through it. But the moment I hit play, Luna switches to repro, quote unquote repro or playback,
Yep.
and will play back what's there. Input allows me to temporarily override this, right? So in other words, it gives me the ability to hit play on the transport and temporarily pass input without having to be in record wiping over top of something.
Yeah.
So this is great when an artist says, hey, let me just practice that. Let me just run through that a time or two. You can just put it on input and you don't run the risk of overwriting what you had there previously.
Gotcha.
So console tracking mode is kind of it's different in the sense
a little bit of both, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, right? It's like, hey, let me have playback and let me have live input. So there's lots of flexibility there, and there's lots of reasons to do things in both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's again, this is all part of the power of Luna and Apollos. Is like any workflow that you want, you can get to. If you want to have be able to play back in Luna and hear everything happening live inside a console, great. Console tracking mode's there to do that. If you want Luna to kind of automatically shut off, turn off the input when you press playback and then turn on when you press record, turn console tracking mode off, because then you're monitoring straight through Luna. So any combination of these workflows is possible, and you'll find, especially if you're kind of more on the tracking side, there's going to be scenarios where you want to go between these different types of workflows. And one of my favorite tricks to do is as Drew mentioned, is pull up a console session. So say especially if you're in a tracking room sort of scenario, you can have a great a template for recording drums. You can have all your favorite preamps and compress. You can have everything kind of dialed in. Like, this makes the drums in my room sound great as a console session. So you can use that session. You can load that in console, be in console tracking mode, load up Luna, add those channels, add the mic inputs. It's still actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it does store that information. So even if you go out of console tracking mode later, then those channels should retain the input configuration, right?
Well, the one thing that cues don't come over from console, but the record paths do come over from console.
Yeah.
And I do believe, actually, I haven't run the test here. That would be something I would want to triple check. Is that when we exit out of console tracking mode, it might hit like a little reset button in Luna to restart storing the settings, right?
Gotcha.
And all of this stuff, Luna is so young, right? We're barely a couple months into this, right? Like, the team is still, tinkering and working on things, right? So like, if you find little quirks about, console tracking mode or entering out of it, or whatever quirks you might find, that's what that feedback button's all about. To be able to like find these edge cases, right? Find these things that are happening and do that. So yeah, I think I would have to test that a little bit, Ben, but
yeah, but I remember like a couple of my very first Luna sessions where we were doing like a larger tracking thing. It was super helpful to be able to build the mix in console first, and then pop open a session, Luna, create the tracks, record, enable. We were ready to go. There was no having to duplicate the setup or having to go back and tweak things. We were able to work between the two really seamlessly.
Yeah, and it looks like, just doing a quick test here, it does look like when you enter and exit out of console tracking mode and then you arm it does sort of create it kind of blows it out.
Gotcha.
It's a little bit of a reset, on that. So
that makes sense.
Yeah. And if, who knows, like I said, Luna's young, I can envision a scenario where, right now Luna doesn't have the ability to store input chains. I would imagine that's in the pipeline. Who knows, right? If enough people request it, the team will work on it. I mean, that would be a great workflow, So
nice.
So I think, I believe, at the 2 hour and 5 minute mark, I think I'm ready to hand it over to Matt.
For the most important segment, most important bit of the whole thing. Matt, how does all of this relate to instrument tracks? We've been talking about audio all day long, like record this,
right?
Recording, dealing with mic inputs, high Z inputs, cues, all that sort of stuff. But the other side, a big thing about making music is using virtual instruments, and how does ARM and all this cue processing apply to that?
Yeah, the short answer is exactly the same as audio tracks. So pretty much everything that Drew just showed applies to instrument tracks as well. The only difference being, when you're using an audio track, the audio is originating at the input of your Apollo and streaming into that DSP path. When you're using an instrument track at ARM, it starts at the computer and then streams to that DSP path. But everything else is identical. So I got an instrument track set up here. I can record ARM it, puts it into ARM mode. Just like when Drew did the same thing on an audio track, only the record effects inserts are active. The monitor effects get grayed out. So I can load plugins here to monitor through them with low latency, just like you can with an audio input. Yeah, now I'm getting signal here. So what this is actually doing, well, before I get to that, so just like Drew showed with the cues on record ARM audio tracks, same thing with the cues on record ARM instrument tracks. Queue section is much smaller on my system, like we talked about before, but I can send signal to the queues directly into that low latency path, just like it could from an audio track. So yeah, all the routing, all the functionality is pretty much exactly the same. It's just a different place where the audio is originating from.
Nice. And so yeah, so you can still use UAD processing. You can even use the ARM enabled sends if you had those set up. Like basically nothing changes except that instead of an audio input, you now have a AU, either a Luna instrument or an AU instrument also works for this, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it can be. I have a shape loaded on this one, but I could do the same thing with any other third-party AU synth. It's the same exact low latency. And that kind of brings up the question of buffer size, which is pretty important when you're playing a virtual instrument. And I'm sure plenty of people have noticed there's no buffer size in Luna. It's because Luna handles everything automatically, basically, so you don't have to think about it, always giving you the lowest latency, but the best performance. There's a balancing act there. So the buffer size on instrument tracks is fixed to 128. It's low enough where you're not going to notice it while you're playing it, but it's high enough to give the CPU a little bit of time to breathe, so you're not going to have, render meter spikes and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's basically always giving you the perfect balance performance and low latency
Nice.
Yeah, and so isn't there some cases where if anyone is having any issues with ARM mode with instrument tracks, like this kind of goes back to what we started the stream talking about, how Luna is using some of the virtuals and some digital stuff in the background and stuff, right? Is there any cases where you could get into trouble there, Matt?
Yeah, definitely. So with where like the analog inputs, they have dedicated DSP paths for themselves because they're physical inputs, they're tied in the Apollo. Or an instrument track, it doesn't have a dedicated DSP path. It has to borrow from something else.
Right.
So in the case of in most cases, when you arm an instrument track, it's going to use a virtual channel in the background. So if I switch over to my console here, where did console go? So yeah, see that once I record ARM the track, this virtual 1 and 2 becomes unmuted. That Korg SCD3000 that I loaded on the track in Luna is now showing up as the inserts here.
That's really cool to see, like sort of a little bit of behind the curtain. You could see what's actually happening. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just borrowing this virtual path from this low latency virtual path from console and using it as the low latency path for the instrument track.
So if you were using virtual 1 and 2 for OS sounds, you could get yourself in a little bit of trouble there, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm on an Arrow, so the amount of these DSP paths that I have is very limited.
Right.
So for example, if I were to have like this virtual 1 and 2 channel isolated, and I were to have analog 1 and 2 isolated like I do now, basically when I record ARM that instrument track in Luna, it's going to have no low latency path to grab.
Gotcha.
So it won't let me put it into ARM mode. It'll just be in regular record ARM, with a little bit higher latency.
Yeah, which makes sense. And this is something that this is the one thing that we've kind of run into with a few people of like, yeah, if you're using a virtual channel, like Drew said, for like OS sound, and then Luna's automatically allocating as efficiently as it possibly can to to give you the instruments in low latency, it's gonna use those virtual paths. So it's really important to like critical ones, like how Drew showed you. If you have a critical path that you don't want to be interrupted or have Luna take it over for the purposes of ARM, is to right click on the channel name in console, and you can select isolate, and then also there's a modifier button over on the left that allows you to select which channels are isolated. And this just means that no matter what you do, and this even applies for opening different console sessions, right, Matt? Like if you've isolated a channel and then you load up a different console session, does it isolate stay to that channel regardless of what you're loading up, or does it reset?
Yeah, I believe isolate is a global function, so it persists through console sessions. Yeah, if you were to load a console session, it'll keep that channel isolated, however you had it before. So yeah, it's a good way to leave whatever settings you have, even if you're loading new console sessions all day as you switch tracking sessions.
Nice. We got a good question here from Don. Does Shape perform better in terms of latency versus other instrument plugins?
No, it's the same with Shape versus like Massive, Native Instruments Massive that I loaded up here. They both operate at 128 buffer size. So yeah, it's going to be the same latency between them.
Nice. And then Stinky was asking, hey, can you record only the MIDI information along with audio channels? So if you're recording something, say you're recording, a microphone and a MIDI keyboard, you can record the two at the same time, but you wouldn't be recording the audio output of your instrument. You're recording the MIDI information that's powering the instrument, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So if I were to record on this instrument track here, what gets recorded is actually MIDI. It's not audio. Even though audio is leaving this track, it's still just recording the MIDI that's coming into it.
Yeah, but the cool thing with Luna is that you can record any combination of MIDI and audio all at the same time. And even, like with some of the effects stuff we were showing earlier with Drew, like say you're recording vocals or you've got some reverb, recording a piano, you can also send that piano to the same reverb. And that's the great thing about the armed auxes is that, you can send multiple things into the same effect to again, give you just a more complete sound as you're tracking.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, Luna doesn't really differentiate between audio and instrument tracks in that regard. You can all send them to the same place. You can monitor them through the same path. It's really seamless in that regard.
Oh, here's a really good question. So, do instrument tracks need to be record enabled to put them into the ARM buffer? Because I've noticed, like, sometimes when you don't have it record enabled and you just have it selected, a lot of times Luna will pass the MIDI information into that instrument. But is there a distinction in the latency between record enabled and not record enabled?
That's a good question that I'm not 100% sure the answer of. I believe the way it works is that when you don't have it record armed, and you just have the track selected and it's still passing MIDI, I believe you're getting the same latency you would if it was just in record arm but not in ARM mode.
Yeah.
I think you actually have to click that ARM mode for it to build that path in the DSP to get the lower latency. So yeah, I mean, even though you can hear signal when you first click the track, you definitely want to put it in ARM mode to get the lowest latency possible.
Yeah. That's pretty much, that's how I've experienced it as well. Like, yeah, if you previewing it and just getting the sound, like, okay, it's there, and then you're like, this even happened to me last night where I was like playing something, I was like, yeah, this, like, why does this feel a little bit weird? Oh yeah, I forgot to record enable it, right. Boom, instantly now it removed the latency that I was experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice. Let's see, any other questions? We've got someone's requesting asking for quick swipe style comping inside of Luna. Yeah, that would be amazing. Hit the feedback button. Let us let the developers know, because the comping right now, it's very similar to like a Pro Tools style. Having multiple versions and then being able to copy paste and move them around. But the quick swipe thing that, like how Logic has it, is pretty slick.
Yeah, you guys have driven Luna's development already. Auto scroll, reverse. I mean, these are classic. There's no way those would have been done as early, because we just didn't know. We didn't know how important they were, and you guys told us how important they were.
Yeah. Danielle's says, so in console tracking mode, monitoring isn't interrupted for the players. In order for the artist to hear plugins, etc., while tracking, we need to have preamps and plugins set up in console. So this is kind of what you were showing, right, Drew? Of like, yeah, you can for console tracking mode, you can be doing the setup inside a console, but it also looked like you could be in Luna. In console tracking mode, you were still able to add and change the record effects and the monitor effects inside of Luna, and it was still communicating back to the console, even though we were
as long as the tracks were armed. Yes, the tracks still need to be armed. Right. So yeah, because then the only way Luna can control a channel in console, regardless, it is that the GUI grays out when the track's not armed. So provided that the track is armed, it basically behaves exactly like a third-party DAW that has software monitoring turned off, or in Pro Tools' cases in LLM, right? So that's console tracking mode, means that your Luna is pretending to be a third-party DAW. and they still act the same way.
Mhm.
So if you do that with Pro Tools, you can hear audio in the monitors and in the cues without a track armed. And then the moment you arm the track, the meter starts to flicker and you can see that. The difference is that Luna has that tight integration and the track needs to be armed in order for you to control the actual processes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Danielle said we need the monitoring to never stop for the live room. Yeah, console tracking mode is definitely what you want because it'll
Exactly.
basically keep the channels from ever being muted. So
Right,
even if
and
you
you can
record arm the track, you can still hear it.
exactly. You can be changed. You can close a Luna session and the artists still hear sound in their headphones. You're still hearing it out of the speakers. Meantime, you're creating a new session, you're building tracks, you're naming them and so forth.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. Wow, guys, this has been a marathon about ARM. This was the reason why we picked this one first, because we knew it was one of the most needed ones, and it was one of the ones that needed the most depth to really kind of understand all the different aspects of it. So yeah, Drew, Matt, guys, you guys absolutely crushed it. This was so much good information, and like I mentioned a little bit earlier, we're using this as our way to develop the Luna Basic version of the same content. So if you've watched all the way through, you're amazing. Thank you, thank you so much for hanging with us. It's been quite a journey here. Obviously we're going to leave these replays up so people can come in and rewatch it. I know there's people who are taking notes and helping us kind of timestamp these as well. So that'll be really helpful to have that information to help direct people around inside of this video. But I guess the last thing, the last obvious question that comes to my mind is, when or why would you ever want to turn ARM off?
Right.
Yeah, we said we would address that, didn't we?
Uh-huh.
We did.
Yep. So there's a couple of scenarios, right? Where the ones that come to my mind right away is like if you wanted to use an AU plugin. So you had an AU insert on an audio track that you needed to hear. It was an essential part of your sound design process. You can turn ARM off. You'll experience extra latency because it's having to travel from the Apollo through the computer, through the processing, back out to the Apollo. So it's not necessarily great for things that need to be rhythmically together or like monitored in real time. But for stuff like drum machines or synths or things that are kind of happening and time doesn't matter, or like pads or keyboard, like stuff where time is a little more relative and latency isn't such a big impact. I could see a use for turning it off there potentially.
And that latency you'll experience will vary depending on what's going on in your mix. The more complex your mix is, the more high latency plugins that are in your mix, the more delay compensation Luna's doing,
Right.
the more latency you'll feel. So
Yeah,
keep that in mind.
I guess one of the other sticky situations, right, is like if you try to throw a super high latency UAD plugin into that queue. So for some reason, say you want precision multiband compressor on your vocal on the way in, your singer's going to be kind of like, what? I'm feeling delay there. There's nothing we can do about that, right? ARM doesn't solve things like super high latency UAD processors, of which there aren't that many. The list of really latent ones is pretty small, as I remember, right?
Yeah, the two that you should really avoid while tracking are Ampex ATR 102 and Precision Multiband, which are typically master bus processes anyway, so not really things you would typically use on an input channel, but yeah. And if you try to load those, like in console, for example, you even get an error telling you that input delay compensation has been exceeded. So
yeah,
there's a warning.
And just so people know, what is that input delay compensation? What exactly is that doing, and is it adding latency to inputs, or what's the thing there?
Yeah, so it's basically a way to keep multiple inputs time aligned if you're using UAD plugins. So say you're micing a drum kit, you got some plugins on the snare drum, some plugins on the kick drum, each with their own delay. Normally, if you didn't have any kind of delay compensation in the input, it would knock those inputs out of phase alignment. So what input delay compensation does is take into account all the plugins you have loaded on input channels, and time aligns them all. So it does add a very, very, very minor amount of latency to the monitoring path, so what you're hearing in the headphones while you're recording, but the record path is fully compensated for, so it still ends up in your DAW in the correct place in the timeline.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And I have it showing on the screen here. You've got 5 positions. You have off, short, medium, long, and long. The only time off is something you can do. You can set it to, if you just have one mic, to one track, right? And you want to minimize the latency as much as you possibly can, you can do that. Short is 100 samples, 200 samples, 300 samples, and then long is 1,000 samples. So
Gotcha.
this, these do add to the latency. I always like to keep mine at short, and then because that means that if you keep it off, and then you do something that would induce an out of phase situation, you could record it that way. So I like to keep it at short, unless I'm doing a single mic to a single track. And then if I need to go to medium, console will let me know. Console will throw up a dialog box saying, hey, you've exceeded the delay compensation. So bump it up to medium or something like that.
Yeah, and if you're on short or medium or whatever, and you have no plugins loaded anywhere, it's not doing anything. So there's no harm to leaving it on.
Right.
And if you have it off and you do load plugins that require input delay compensation, it won't tell you. So the best use case is really leave it on short. It won't do anything when you don't need it, but it'll still warn you if you need more.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just to really paint it super clear for people, like imagine you have two microphones on your snare drum. In one of them, you've added 1176. You had Pultec. You had a couple of plugins, some processing to that one, but not to the other. Every plugin, UAD, the DSP stuff, it's happening in just a few samples, but those few samples will just slightly change the phase of put them just slightly out of phase from each other, and it could end up in some weird it could just be kind of a weird sound that isn't what you were going for. So adding that little bit of compensation will take the one that doesn't have any added delay, any processing on it, and just slightly delay it so the two stay phase accurate with each other. But as Drew mentioned, like 100 samples is like 0 something of a millisecond. Like we're talking.
Don't make me do that. Don't make me do that.
I can't do that. Too big of numbers there. But it's infinitesimal amounts of delay that's being added for the positive gain of keeping all of your tracks in phase with each other.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then I guess one of the other things we had kind of talked about here was like the gain staging aspect of passing through buses. If that's super, if you're super in the weeds, and again, latency isn't an issue, then I guess you can turn ARM off, and now it'll go through the Studer, it'll go through the Neve, it'll go through your entire routing scenario. Again, which kind of ends up working out all right. Like if you got like a drum machine or something that's just happening, and it's not you're not gonna have a human complaining about the latency on their coming to their headphones. Then those are kind of a case where having ARM off would give you the complete sonic picture of it.
Or you're tracking through like Valhalla Shimmer or something, where it's like, some, legato drawn out effect where it doesn't matter. You just want to hear it.
Yeah, totally. I think we talked about the satellite thing earlier. I think somebody brought that up asking about satellites, but that's
the DSP needs to be local thing. Yep.
Yep. And we talked about DSP pairing. Wow, dude, everything that we had kind of saved for the end of these, you guys asked questions throughout that helped us get through this.
Yeah, really.
There's one last question. There's another question here. What if you wanted to commit to a native preamp sound on a mic input? So that would be an example of if you turned ARM off, you could monitor through. You still wouldn't be able to commit to it. So the record effects area in Luna, that's limited to UAD DSP plugins only. But down in the monitor section, you could monitor through AU plugins if you have ARM turned off.
Yep.
Nice.
So we have a lot of people who just changed their delay comp to short. It looks like.
Nice. Yep. And see people downloading 1.0.6. Yep. It is out. You can go update.
We were on it. Like I was, but both Matt and I were showing that.
Yeah, guys, unless any other questions come through here in the next couple seconds, like I think we have exhausted the topic of ARM. We now have a video you can point, use this whole session as a reference. Feel free to send it to friends or family if anyone's running into having trouble with ARM or having trouble with a certain concept around ARM. Odds are that we touched on it here in this video. And yeah, anything else? Any parting words of advice, Drew or Matt?
Gosh, no, I don't know. I think rewatch this, right? Watch it a few times, pause it, try these things out for yourself. I couldn't really do some of this stuff, but like just sitting at your rig with a guitar and headphones and a mic and like, trying these various different things, see where your latency tolerance is and see what you notice and don't notice. And then just work through these things. And like, it takes a while, and Luna is like really unique and super cool, and has some like what the team did with this hardware and software. It's like, I mean, we've been working at it for months, and we're still learning stuff every day. So like, just keep at it and keep experimenting and find out what works for you.
Nice. Yeah, awesome. And if you guys have suggestions for future topics you want to see us do deep dives on, hit us up on social media, on the UAD forums. We also do have a dedicated email address for the live crew, live@uaudio.com. That's the best place if you want to submit music to be featured in the countdown. Hit us up, live@uaudio.com. If you've got suggestions or ideas for shows ideas that you want to see us cover, hit us up, live@uaudio.com. We're always listening. We love hearing back from you guys, the feedback on these shows, and we're not doing these just to hang out and talk to each other all day. We're here for you guys. So whatever you guys want to see us do next, we're here to do it. I believe on the docket for deep dives, just to let you guys know, we've got Shape is coming up next. Tom's gonna walk us through. We're gonna similar approach. We're gonna exhaust you guys on everything that Shape can do.
That's gonna be awesome.
Yeah, because
that's gonna be awesome.
It goes so deep. Like, we've demoed it a few times, showed some cool stuff that it can do, but like, man, there's so much going on in that one instrument that it deserves its own full on deep dive.
Yep,
totally. And then I'm trying to remember what one is coming after that.
Doing a MIDI deep dive after that.
Yeah,
I'll be doing that one.
Yeah, we're hearing from a lot of people that they really want to see more about MIDI production and electronic music production inside of Luna. So obviously instrument tracks and MIDI capabilities. Yet again, there's so much to uncover there. So Shape next week. I think Shape is next week. MIDI is the week after with Matt, and then maybe we'll do the summing, or kind of have also been, we did I did an office hour, I think, about integrating Ableton and Luna together, but kind of maybe doing a deep dive, kind of showing how you integrate with Pro Tools, with Logic, with, both for moving sessions from one to the other, but also integrating them at the same time. There's some cool stuff that we can do around there. I think I'm not seeing any other upgrade comments. Yeah, I think, guys, that about does it for today's show. Thank you so much. I know I see some familiar names in the chat. Thanks for hanging out with us all day long, and for so many of these. So good to see you guys coming out and supporting and also helping each other. The positivity in the comments here. It's always great to see just like how good of a community these live sessions bring around.
Yeah, you guys are awesome.
Yep, it's awesome.
Yeah, awesome, guys.
Nice work, Drew.
Yeah,
thanks.
Well done,
Thanks,
Drew.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you guys back here next week. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
See you guys.